Now our first speaker is Kurt Swartz, is the director of MEMA, the Massachusetts, I'm blanking, holy cow, Emergency Management Agency. Right, so the MEMA, and he's going to speak to us now about preparing for a race such as the Boston Marathon. So we'll do a little switch up.
Perfect. Well, thank you. It's really my pleasure to be here. For me, I'm 80 to 90% on my way to the vineyard when I come through Falmouth. So that's home for me over there. So I'm almost home. So, so thank you. You know, we're a small enough group that if at any point you have a question, a comment, just go ahead and raise your hand and see if you can knock me off track. That's okay. I don't mind going where you want to go. So I normally tell people not to do that in a large crowd, but I think we can do that here. So, thanks, Chris, for the invitation to be here. It's great to be with friends like Chris and Dave and Matt and others. I'm going to focus on the process we use, and I'll talk about who we is, because we is a lot bigger than me. The process we use to develop, and all of these are important words, comprehensive, multi-jurisdictional, all hazards, safety, and security plan for the Boston Marathon. So I'm going to focus on the marathon, the work we do. Again, we is a very large, it refers to a lot of people, but the principles, the ideas behind this translate into planning for any type of event, large or small. But certainly the marathon is a large event. So, so we're going to focus on the challenges, safety and security challenges for an event like the Boston Marathon. I am not, the focus of this presentation is not on the 2013 Boston Marathon and the bombings, but we'll revisit it because one of the points we need to understand when we're doing planning, things go wrong despite good plans, despite perfect plans, things still can go wrong, and the challenge of ours is to figure out, is to plan for things going wrong. And then I want to focus on the planning process and really hone in on this concept of reducing risk. This is why we plan. This is what you're doing here tonight. It's to think about how you reduce, you can't always eliminate, but how do you reduce risk and what strategies can you employ? So the Boston Marathon, I don't need to tell you folks too much about the Boston Marathon, but when we talk about the challenges of a marathon, there's some unique things to Boston. I've given this presentation pretty much around the world, so I'm often in places where people don't know a lot about the Boston Marathon. But a marathon, we all know it's 26.2 miles, but thanks for Dave. I know you set this up 100 and something years ago as a straight line. Just a really bad idea from a planning perspective, a straight line marathon for lots of reasons we'll talk about. One of our big challenges is that we run through 8 cities and towns and 3 different counties, but 8 cities and towns, as you're going to hear, just brings lots of complexity, not just to planning but to operations, because frankly there are so many people in charge across 8 cities and towns. So the size, 30,000. So yes, there are marathons, a number of marathons that are larger in terms of number of people. This 1 million spectators that I don't think any of us really know on a really good day, good weather day, how many spectators we have. I can tell you in 2018, which was about the worst weather we could have ever had, the number of spectators, maybe there were 50,000. I don't know what it was 2018. But on a beautiful, sunny, nice day, 2014, for example, was a huge year for spectators. Do we have 1 million? I don't know, but let's just say it's a lot of people. And a challenge from a planning perspective, safety and security, is this is a long event. Race is open for approximately 6 hours, but the safety and security program runs far longer than that. By the time, starting when people start getting out on the course, not just the race, the event personnel and the volunteers, but all the public safety officials start securing to the time they all wrap up. It's a long day. I have a few pictures just to give you a flavor of the density of the runners, the crowds. You face some of the same things, I believe, in your road race, meaning narrow roads that are frankly probably too narrow for the number of participants. So you're probably dealing with views that look like this as well. But this picture on the left is Framingham. That's a number of miles into the course. So it's not at the start line, and you see just the density. You see how close the spectators are to the runners. That presents all sorts of security challenges as well. And a few pictures of the finish line. Again, I have you focus on not just the density of runners, but look in the picture on the right at the number of spectators. Now, the picture on the right was taken in 2013. This is earlier in the day by several hours than when the bombs went off. This before lead runners come in, but look at the density of spectators, and we're going to come back to that, and we're going to talk about some of the things that have changed since 2013. But as you look at that, and you see the line of flags on what, from your looking the left side of the street, it's at two different, that's along that line of flags is where the two bombs were placed and went off. So planning challenges, just the sheer number of stakeholders and partners that have to come to the table to plan for this type of event and this size of event. So when we talk about 8 cities and towns, you're bringing in 8 local police departments, 8 local fire departments, 8 different EMS providers, 8 different public works, departments of transportation. So all the different local organizations that you would have bring to the table in Falmouth times 8. And then we add in a number of state agencies, many hospitals that are participating, railroad police, because we have railroad lines that cross or run parallel to the course, National Guard, a host of federal agencies, and we'll talk a little more about why it is. And then you start seeing numbers. Now these, I think some of these numbers were really from 2017. So how many BAA volunteers were there last year? Chris, so I think it was 11,000 in 2017, but we put out about 4,000 uniformed law enforcement officers. So planning challenge, just developing a comprehensive plan and executing it when you have so many people. So when you start planning for an event, the first thing you have to do is understand your threats and hazards. I mean, what are the risks you're planning against. You'll always have to plan against a risk. So you have to stop and ask yourself, what might happen? What am I worried about? And then I develop a plan against that. Now, I got to tell you, in public safety and particularly in event management, this piece gets skipped over way too often. And I'll tell you, I have a background. I spent 10 years in law enforcement, about 15 years in EMS. I've been in Homeland Security and Emergency Management for 12 years. So I have some visibility on how public safety plans for events, particularly at the local level. And this is the piece that we often don't spend enough time on. What are we worried about? What are our concerns? So when we think about the Boston Marathon, and I imagine it is no different than when you think about the Falmouth Road Race, the number one hazard that we worry about is Mother Nature. And as the state emergency management director, when I think about the hazards that we plan against in the state, the number one hazard that we deal with in terms of frequency is Mother Nature. Just in the last month, I have responded to 3 different tornadoes and a major flooding event last weekend. Last winter, we had 3 major snowstorms and flooding events in March. So it's Mother Nature that we think about. So for the Boston Marathon, because of the time of year, meaning mid-April, we have to plan for extreme heat and extreme cold. I just had a conversation with Matt and Dave about, severe thunderstorms and lightning and how to plan against that. Unfortunately, we have to plan for rain and for snow, flooding, winds, tornadoes. A number of years ago, I started in the planning process for the marathon. I started talking about tornadoes, and some people thought I was crazy to be talking about tornadoes in April, and then 2 years ago we had a tornado in February. So we know that tornadoes can happen in April. Marathon temperatures. If we look just back over a number of years, 1976, and I pull this stuff off of the internet. I wasn't here, so, but 96 degrees. I was here, though. I was here for 2012, 89, 2015, which was a cold year, 46. 2017, which we jumped to the other side, a warm year again, 77. This past year, which was just brutally cold and wet, when we had temperatures at part of the day down around 35. So planning considerations. That red line is meant to just suggest that there is a temperature in which we have to collectively think about whether or not it is safe to run the race. We debated that in 2012. I don't think that there isn't a clear standard of what is that temperature, but we know that somewhere in the 80s, I think we know that somewhere in the 80s, depending on other circumstances, there is probably a point where it is not advisable or sufficiently safe to run the race. So we've come up against that. Certainly we did in 2012. But beyond Mother Nature, we all need to be thinking about other hazards. And this would be no different in Falmouth or Boston, but things like how do you manage a fire along the course? Course blockages, whether due to downed wires, downed trees, transportation incidents, hazardous materials incidents. There's any number of things that we have to plan against that can impact a race, particularly events or incidents that occur while the race is ongoing. Something occurs before the race starts, the decision is significantly easier. You know, if the course isn't passable, you can delay the start of a race. But what do you do when the race is already underway and you have something that causes a course blockage? These are other types of hazards, but where we have spent the most time in terms of evaluating risk is looking at our man-made threats. And, you know, we have always, well before 2013, we've always thought about threats. We've planned for threats. But we undertook a whole new planning process and a real new understanding, if not appreciation, after the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. And, you know, I will say that the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings not only changed how we, those of us associated with planning for the marathon, think about threats for this event, but across the entire country, the way event promoters and sponsors and public safety think about pre-planned events changed as a result of the Boston Marathon bombing. So, threats. You remember when we had Occupy New York and Occupy Boston a number of years ago? So protesters on the course. So with the Occupy movement a number of years ago, we began actively thinking about and planning for dealing with protesters on the course. And we'll talk more about what that has meant for us in Boston in managing it. Vehicles as weapons. Again, just today, internationally, there was another car ramming attack that killed somebody. There was one in London just a few days ago. But vehicles as weapon becoming one of the most common terrorist tactics out there today. And we'll talk about how we deal with that. Active shooters, whether it's a single person with a handgun, or complex coordinated attacks, multiple shooters, and you know, we now think after Las Vegas, the incident in Las Vegas, we think about snipers. Improvised explosive devices, unfortunately we've had experience with that. Drones. Drones as weapons. Seen increasing concerns amongst the intelligence and terrorism communities about the use of drones as weapons. You know, most recently, in just a few weeks ago, the use of a drone in an assassination attempt of a foreign president in a foreign country. So becoming more and more of a reality. Cyber attacks, I'll talk a little more about that, but this was really a new focus of ours this past year, is what are our vulnerabilities as an event and to the public safety for an event? What are our vulnerabilities to cyber disruptions? Snipers. Now, I bolded drone cyber attacks and snipers. These were three threats that we really added to our planning matrix in the past year or two, just based upon world events. So, as I said, you have to assess your degree of risk. Now, your risk in Falmouth is going to be different than the risk of the Boston Marathon. Boston Marathon is considered within the Homeland Security community as an event with a fairly high level of risk when we're talking about man-made acts and threats. Why is one of the world major marathons, so if it's, defer to others, but it's the big one. This is, of the major marathons, this is the Boston Marathon. So an iconic event with a huge international draw. It brings in people from all over the world. It is televised locally, streamed worldwide, live. It occurs on Patriots Day. And if you're a terrorist, and we know because the intelligence community tells us that the fact that this occurs on Patriots Day has been a matter that's been discussed and pointed to by terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda and ISIS propaganda, these are two terrorist organizations that continue in their literature and propaganda to point to the Boston Marathon both as a success in terms of an attack, but every year since 2013, one or both of these organizations in the ramp up, in the events in the months leading up to the marathon, puts out propaganda and puts out information literature asking its followers to again attack this event. All of this results in the Department of Homeland Security for the last, starting in 2014 and right through 2018, and I'm sure it'll be the same in 19, is rating this as a level 2 event. Department of Homeland Security rates events from level 1 to level 5. Level 2 event mean there are only about 15 to 20 level 2 events in the country every year. We have 2 of them here in Massachusetts every year, 4th of July festivities in Boston and the Boston Marathon. Level 1 events, in any year, there are usually maybe just 2 or 3 level 1 events. We had a level 1 event a year ago, June, in Boston with Sail Boston Tall Ships event. So considered a high-risk event. Now, I'm going to sort of move through this quickly because we don't need to spend a lot of time revisiting. But again, you know, when things go bad despite a good, but I said not great plan, because our public safety plan in 2013 was a good plan, but it was not a great plan. We had holes and gaps that likely, no matter what we did, we likely weren't going to prevent this from occurring, but it was a good plan, but not a great plan. Our plan today is far stronger than it was in 2013. So despite a good public safety plan, we did have 2 brothers using improvised explosive devices, pressure cooker bombs and backpacks, managed to avoid detection, get out along Boylston Street, and plant their 2 bombs. There are photographs of the 2 brothers known, you know, around the world in the days after as Black Cap and White Cap, or Black Hat and White Hat, but they're the 2 brothers as they moved along Boylston Street with their bombs. So, you know, 2 bombs, 210 yards apart, pressure cooker bombs, very significant casualties, significant injuries. 3 people died instantly, no post-blast fatalities, and I'll talk just a little bit about why. Some of the factors that contributed to that, you know, that was a combination of great plans, great operations, great execution, great hospitals, great EMS staff, great first responders, and some good luck too. I show these pictures just as a reminder of the force of the explosions, not to take people back to things. And we certainly need to remember the 3 people died. And then Officer Sean Collier died the following, you know, 4 days later on Thursday during the manhunt. And, you know, I apologize that there also there is a 5th victim. There's a Boston police officer that died sometime later, and his picture should be up there as well. Good plans mitigate bad outcomes. This is a phenomenal picture, and it's this is a picture around the site of the first bombing, and I point this out because, you know, these are Chris's people. These are the medical volunteers who came out of the medical tent at the finish line and only had to go, 100 feet or so and went to work. And, I can tell you there's probably many more, but you can easily spot 7, 8 physicians, BAA physicians, working in here. But in that picture, you see doctors, nurses, EMTs, paramedics, police officers, firefighters, regular volunteers, and a whole many just regular citizens, eyewitnesses that went to work. This is part of the reason that there were no post-blast fatalities, was the incredible care. And was there a plan to empty the medical tent and put those people to work for a bomb? No, there wasn't. But there was an incredible EMS plan and capability there that allowed this great result to happen. Other factors that worked in our favor. Boston has 6, some people say 7 level 1 trauma centers within minutes of the bombing site. We had some 260 injured right around, just several months after this. You may remember a plane coming into the San Francisco International Airport carrying about 260 people, crashed landing. It hit the seawall coming in, but had about 260 survivors. Same number, roughly, as Boston Marathon. San Francisco has 1 level 1 trauma center. So you all that are in the medical world, just think of the difference if you're trying to provide trauma care to 260 patients, whether you have 6 trauma centers or 1 trauma center. Chris will take credit for having created all these trauma centers, but were we the beneficiaries of this? Yes. A great EMS plan. Where did all of those ambulances come from that were able to transport these people so quickly? That's a great plan. Good relationships mitigate bad outcomes. There was one of the deficiencies in our public safety plan in 2013 was that there was not working in Boston at the time of the bomb an emergency operations center. The city of Boston did not have an emergency operations center or a unified command center or a unified coordination center operating when the bombs went off. They didn't see the need to have one. So that was identified as a gap, but despite that gap, what allowed a very effective command and therefore operation to occur was there were good relationships between all of the key people that allowed the key people to assume command, to transition from managing an event to managing the response to a mass casualty terrorist incident. I use this picture because the back of that ambulance is where the first unified command stood up. How do I know? Because I'm in that picture. My job, when I arrived on Boylston Street, which is about 2 minutes after the bombs went off, my job was to ensure that a command stood up. It was one of the great failings if you look at the response to major incidents. It's the failure of command to take command quickly. Often what happens is people jump right into the response and command sort of gets organized slowly. We managed to stand up a command within minutes, and around the back of this ambulance, within just 2 or 3 minutes, was from the state police, the major who was the incident commander for the day, the chief of the transit police department, the superintendent-in-chief of the Boston Police Department, the chief of Boston EMS, and a deputy Boston fire chief. So despite a plan, the good relationships allowed that to happen. Good relationships continued after the response. We did not have a reunification plan for this event. We never contemplated, we didn't plan for it. But despite there being a plan, the state and the city and the event, the Boston Athletic Association and the Red Cross, within about 90 minutes, stood up the Safe and Well website and began the process of reunification, stood up a family assistance center. That family assistance center was operational in about 2 to 3 hours simply by taking over an empty building in the area and going to work. We didn't have plans for that, but we had good relationships that allowed us to do that. But again, it was a gap in our plans. So, planning, just some notes on planning. What's our primary objective? It's all about reducing risk. That starts, as I said, with identifying your threats and hazards. And the second point is one that we do now that we didn't do prior to or for 2013, is you have to plan against your reasonable worst case scenario. Planners need to get together long before an event and say, what is the reasonable worst case scenario that we could have? How bad is bad? You have to define that and then plan against it. We didn't go through that exercise prior to 2013 from the public safety community. We do now. So you plan against your reasonable worst case scenario. Now, once you know what your reasonable worst case scenarios are, I mean, how bad can the weather be and how will that impact people? How bad can a terrorist incident be? So you just run through all of it and then say, what are the impacts? And that starts to tell you what resources you need. And then you ask, where am I going to get those resources? And very importantly, do we have the funds or the money to have those resources on hand? For a lot of events, it may be that you define your reasonable worst case scenario and you conclude that we need to plan for a mass casualty incident with 300 patients. And then you say, but there's no way in the world that we can have enough resources on hand to deal with 300 because we don't have enough money, the community doesn't have enough resources. I get that. But you should get there knowingly and understand what your gaps are rather than just say, well, I'm not even going to plan for it. So you have to consider cost and consider sustainability. Sustainability is a huge issue that we deal with for the Boston Marathon in terms of our public safety plan. Our plan is incredibly expensive. When you tally up all that the Boston Athletic Association contributes to public safety, all of the communities, the state, the federal government, I keep thinking each year that there's no way we can do that again next year, but it's such an iconic event we do. But when you spend $1 million plus on the public safety for an event, you say, is that sustainable? And then your plans reduce risk by looking at prevention, protection, consequence management, and command, coordination, communication, common operating picture. The biggest change we've made since 2013 from a public safety perspective is right here in prevention and protection. We didn't invest a lot of resources in prevention and protection. If those two brothers wanted to do what they did, or two people like that, again, they would have a much harder time getting onto Boylston Street undetected now than they did then, because that's because of the efforts we put into prevention and protection. A couple events about working with an event promoter. You have to have a good relationship. Now, I am both blessed and cursed in my role to work on 100 pre-planned events a year. Many of them have event promoters. Many of them are just community events. I'm blessed and cursed because I'm blessed because I get to do it once a year with the Boston Athletic Association, and there is no better event promoter out there anywhere in the world from a public safety perspective than the Boston Athletic Association. I'm cursed because I go into other events where you ask your event promoter for something, anything, for support, and the answer you get is no. It's not my job to do your public safety. I put on the event, and it's your problem to deal with public safety. You have to have a great working relationship. You need to define roles and responsibilities, understand what the event promoter is responsible for, what public safety is responsible for, where you're working together, how you're collaborating. The event promoter is an important public safety partner. Include the event promoter in public safety meetings and planning groups, and the alternate, when I speak to I sometimes speak to event promoters and associations, and I say the opposite thing. You have to include public safety in your planning meetings, and that does not always happen. Determine early on whether the promoter is contributing funds and equipment or other resources to public safety. This is not a discussion that should take place on the morning of the event. It has to be defined early. And finally, public safety planning is a shared responsibility between public safety and the event promoter. And I will tell you, there are a lot of events and some very large events where it is not considered a shared responsibility. And most often, when there's a breakdown, it's the event promoter that sees itself as being the public safety authority, and at the same time, the public safety officials don't see it as their responsibility. It's, I'll show up, I'm going to do my details, but it's not my job to plan public safety. So our planning process for the Boston Marathon, my agency is the lead on the public safety side. We are the lead agency to facilitate multi-jurisdictional planning. Every community does its planning, some on its own, but we are the responsible party for multi-jurisdictional planning. We do this in a complete partnership from day one with the Boston Athletic Association and Dave and his organization. And for the 2019 Boston Marathon, we held a planning meeting. The BAA, Dave's organization, Chris, Matt, and MEMA just last week. 10 months in advance of the next marathon, we're already planning. But our process always starts with convening an executive committee, bringing in the public safety and event promoter leadership team, and having that discussion about what are our threats and hazards, what are we worried about, what are our risks, and defining the planning cycle. You have got to get buy-in at the beginning on what are your planning objectives, and then you go to work. We do it by creating public safety working groups. There are also BAA working groups that are separate. We do all partner meetings, we do training, and I'm going to talk about exercises. At the end, we always produce since 2013, we have produced a comprehensive operations plan. That's critical. Public safety working groups, these have been fairly static for the last few years. Next year we may tweak this up and add another group in here, but this tends to be where we focus on. Our public safety working groups typically go to work in January and work from January to April over a 4-month period. The BAA has, as I said, a number of its own working groups. I only listed a few of them here, but while public safety is working, the promoter or the event sponsor is also working, and we make sure that we're collaborating and sharing. We have focused a lot of energy, resources, and money in training since 2013. We determined that our public safety community, our first responders and our secondary responders, did not have appropriate training in some areas, such as bomb threat management, crisis leadership, decision-making, incident command. Field force extraction is a program to deal with protesters on courses. Behavioral observation, but this is a law enforcement program to train law enforcement officers to detect suspicious activity. And just for the Boston Marathon, in the last 5 years, we've trained 2,200 first responders just for this event. As I said, we produce a very comprehensive plan. It is, frankly, too comprehensive. The plan for this event is now about this thick. It means that we have to have people in our Emergency Operations Center whose sole job it is to know the plan and to make sure if we have an incident or event that people like me who serve as the EOC manager have somebody who can tell me, here's what the plan says, boss, because it's just too big. But it's comprehensive. Exercise series. Do you folks do a pre-event public safety exercise down here? Nobody's saying yes, so I'm going to assume no. So this is a critical thing. Think about this for next year. We have for many years done at least one exercise. The last several years we've done 2 exercises, 2017 and 18. We did an incident commanders senior leadership tabletop, bringing together all the incident commanders, senior leaders with the Boston Athletic Association to do a tabletop exercise around decision-making, critical decision-making. We also do a functional exercise for all of our command centers. Now, I'll show you the architecture for command centers, but our functional exercise has, 500 plus people exercising on that day. And picture on the right, well, these 2 pictures are the State Emergency Operations Center, which serves as the Unified Command Center for the race. Prevention, pre-event public engagement. Again, this is an emphasis since 2013. How do you prevent something happening by engagement with the public? So we, meaning the Boston Athletic Association, supported by Public Safety, posts lists of items that are not allowed, are not acceptable along the course by spectators. We do a very public see something, say something campaign. This is a billboard on the bottom right. We do a leave your drone at home, no drone zone campaign. We start working weeks ahead of the event with the public. There's a very large intelligence component to prevention. We do an awful lot through our intelligence partners with all of the federal agencies, state agencies, trying to identify that one person that might pose a threat by doing it in advance. We know today that for many terrorist events around this country, the perpetrator has been on the radar screen of law enforcement or the intelligence community sometime in the past. So, and that was true for the Boston Marathon bombing. So we have a very comprehensive program to scrub databases, to go out and knock on people's doors, people that have come across the radar screen before, and to do a pre-event assessment. Prevention. We have added across all 8 communities enhanced security zones, checkpoints where people coming up to watch the course may have to walk through a checkpoint, have bags examined. They may have to walk through or buy bomb-sniffing dogs. Heavy uniformed law enforcement presence, which is sort of true anywhere around the country now. Use of barriers to separate spectators from runners. That's hard to do for 26.2 miles on both sides of the road. You're doing 50-plus miles of barriers. That's really hard to do, but the Boston Marathon greatly expanded the use of barriers to try to build that separation between the spectator and the runner. Why? It allows law enforcement, gives them a better chance of detecting a would-be bad guy with those barriers. Use of heavy vehicles to prevent vehicle ramming attacks. Is this something you do for the Falmouth road race? Yes. So, this is, in the last 3 years, the number of heavy vehicles has increased dramatically. Last year, across 26.2 miles, there were 400-plus dump trucks and school buses and other types of vehicles. Just think of the cost, because somebody is paying for every one of those. So is it sustainable? We can talk about it, but is it necessary? In today's threat environment, we've deemed that necessary. And these numbers will continue to go up as long as we're seeing car ramming attacks. Overwatch and sniper posts. For the last number of years, since 2013, we have had limited sniper posts, Overwatch posts. This past year, for 2018, that number greatly increased as a result of the incident in Las Vegas. So this year, I think 6 of our 8 communities had snipers on rooftops over most crowded areas. So again, a new reality. Enhanced monitoring of critical networks. We use a number of public safety technology systems to support public safety. We have interoperable radio systems, and our radio systems, just like yours today, many of them are IP-based. They run through networks and over cellular lines. We use WebEOC. We use ArcGIS and Esri products. We use a number of different detection systems to detect hazardous materials. All of those are technology and network-based. This year, for the first time, we worked with the Department of Homeland Security, and the federal government activated the National Operations Center and their National Cyber Detection Center, and did enhanced monitoring of our system starting a week before the event. Again, it's a new world, something new. Just looking at my time. So I'm going to wrap up. I've gone over. I'm looking at Chris. So where's Chris? He left. Okay, I'll keep talking. So I'm going to wrap up in 5 minutes because I've gone too long by just talking about command and coordination. We run a unified coordination center, but I'm really going to show this architecture. Remember, we have 8 cities and towns. So we run a unified coordination center, which is in my state emergency operations center, a race operations center in Boston on the right. Each city and town runs an emergency operations center, and then we have a number of other operations centers, including FBI, National Operations Center, National Guard, Public Health. We have to tie all of that together in an architecture to do real-time information sharing, decision-making, which is our biggest challenge, is to how to share information and coordinate decision-making across so many different jurisdictions, and this remains a challenge for us. These are just examples of systems we use, WebEOC, ArcGIS. I'm going to just end with these few slides on tactical resources. What do we put out on the law enforcement side? We now divide 26 miles into 14 different tactical zones. Every tactical zone has a full SWAT response team, a full EOD bomb both detection and disarmament teams, snipers, hazmat response teams, hasty cars, which are rapid response, law enforcement rapid response teams. A huge commitment. So we've got 14 SWAT teams working just for one event. So 44-person SWAT teams, 13 civil disobedience response teams, 10, we have all of these hazmat and EOD detection teams. Last year we had 7 aircraft flying to support public safety. Intelligence and investigations, let me just skip over that. And I want to point just on the EMS side to some numbers, and Chris helped me with these numbers the other day, and I think this is my last slide. It's interesting. 2017 was a relatively hot year for the Boston Marathon. 2018 was an incredibly cold, wet, windy year for the marathon. I was a little surprised when we put these numbers together, but Chris, you probably already knew that. I just never looked at them. But the total number of people that required medical attention was fairly similar from one year to the next. But the big difference was where they needed the attention. So in 2017, which was a hot year, 1,620 people required medical attention at the finish line, and 825 on the course. 2018, that number completely flipped, with many, many more requiring medical attention along the course and far fewer at the finish line. Actually, more hospital visits in the hot year than the cold year, but I think it's fair to say that we learned a lot from this year's cold event in terms of our plan, in that we got whacked along the course in terms of people needing medical attention, exceeding capacity. In the other area we got whacked where I don't have the numbers on this up here, is the number of people that either stopped running and went and found some place to get warm, and then continued running, or people that dropped out along the course because it was just plain too cold. So I'm going to stop there, just because I've talked too long already. But if I leave you with anything, it's define your threats and hazards on the front end and really define those worst case scenarios, and then build a plan around that. So on that, thank you, and apologize that I went too long. So thank you.
Okay, we're going to set up for our next speaker. I'm going to ask the people that are kind of over in the wings there if you could kind of move over this way. We have plenty of seats over here. I know Doug likes to be interactive. He likes to have people in front. So if you could move over this way, that'd be great. Just so you know, thank you very much, Kurt. Some of us here are on the organizing committee for the Falmouth Road Race, and I can assure you that the medical team is just one part of this whole thing. This is all going on here at Falmouth as well, with law enforcement and public safety and all that stuff. So it's happening here as well. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Doug Casas from the University of Connecticut, specifically the Corey Stringer Institute at the University of Connecticut. Doug is the CEO of that institution, and we'll talk about that. If he doesn't, we'll talk about it in my talk, but we'll, without further ado, Dr. Doug Casas.
said, this will actually be the 20th straight year I'm working medical, but I also did it a couple years in the mid-90s as well. So it's an honor every year to be here. It's my favorite road race to work of all the road races I've worked in my career. But a lot of the people I work with, I see some familiar faces right now, but I've worked with all 20 of those years, which is amazing. A lot of my family has gotten involved as well. It's how I got to know Dr. Jardine and Dr. Davis. And in the last few years, it's given me the opportunity to work with Chris Cramps again, which has been fantastic. So my topic is exertional heat stroke. And my goal here is if you have any questions that you can ask them while I'm speaking. And I even said to Chris, how much time do I have? I can make this talk 2 hours. I can make it 27 minutes. I can make it anything you want to make it. Okay? So my goal is to try to have, if you have lingering questions, or if you might be at other races, or you might be concerned about heat stroke with your kids in high school sport or college sport or in youth sport, things outside the landscape of just Falmouth road race, that I might be able to be helpful related to that. Just as a little bit of a background, I've studied exertional heat stroke for the last 25 years as a researcher. We've published over 200 research publications related to heat stroke. So we've done a lot of research studies related to this topic. I've also worked clinical care at over 100 road races where heat strokes take place, and also consult with the Air Force and the Army for our government with setting up their protocols at a lot of different military bases. So we have a lot of experience, and hopefully that information can be helpful. Like I said, if you have questions, ask them, okay? If it's a silly question, I'll let you know right away, so there's no doubt if there's any question if it's silly or not, then we can move on to the question. All right? So this specifically, what I asked to present here today is related to this journal article that came out in April, which is really important. The journal's Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. The journal article is up here. It's called Consensus Statement, Pre-Hospital Care of Exertional Heat Stroke. You can see it just came out in 2018. And why this is really important is it's the first time that the EMS, EMT, emergency room physician world kind of, I think, came up to speed in terms of best practices for exertional heat stroke. The athletic training community and the team physician community, the sports medicine community has been doing this for the last like 15, 20 years. And the military community for another 15 or 20 years before that, okay? But in terms of making it nationally, in terms of the EMS, EMT, emergency room physician, they have been slow to adapt a lot of the best practices for heat stroke. And so it's really important that we are all on the same page, because you have the athletic trainer and a team physician at a particular place, right? They're following one policy, and it's very different than the policies that the EMS, EMT have as they arrive on the scene. So they're not in cahoots with each other, and we've had to overcome that at some of our country's largest military bases, and we have, because the physicians had a particular protocol they want implemented, but the ambulance services that were coming into service had a different idea. But obviously everyone wanted just the best care for the person that they're taking care of. So this just came out, and it's a big step forward for us, because as you can imagine, it's really hard to try to implement policy across the country and change things, because a lot of people have done things for a really long time and they don't want to change. But to give you an example, at the high school level for high school sport, there's 7 million high school athletes in America, but there's no governing body for high school sports in America. So all 51 states, including the District of Columbia, set their own policies. They all have their own state high school athletic association. So for us to work to change a policy, whether it be for AEDs or heat stroke or emergency action plans, whatever it is, we have to go to 51 different organizations to get them to change. Our work at KSI does that. We're in the middle of a $1 million fundraising campaign called Raise Your Rank. We're going to be visiting all 51 states. We've already visited 2 of them, but in the next 5 years we'll be visiting all 51. But it gives you an idea that it's not an easy process to get policy change. It's not like the NCAA. One governing body can influence all of the colleges, so you just have to sit down at the table with one group. All right? So the high school level, very tough. So it was really important to have a document like this. So we're defining heat stroke. It's 2 diagnostic criteria that we want to consider that helps it separated from other conditions. If these 2 things are present, severe hypothermia at the time of collapse or at the time of presentation, and organ dysfunction. Okay? So typically we're talking about CNS dysfunction. So CNS dysfunction, people who've worked medical 10 at Falmouth are well aware. Things like combativeness, confusion, altered consciousness or complete coma, seizures. It could be anything like that that you would define as CNS dysfunction. mind, when you get to people really quickly, they sometimes have a lucid interval. It might be 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes that they don't have this full presentation of Cns dysfunctions. But we still kind of assume the worst because we don't want to lose those minutes of cooling that we could lose. I'll tell you a funny story once. We had a person come in to our medical tent who had sprained their ankle, at the end of the race, went up on a curve, but sprained their ankle, and came in and said, I sprained my ankle, and they were coming towards where we do the rectal temperatures. And I was like, if you take 2 more steps, you're having your rectal temperature taken, regardless that you have an ankle injury. And I'm not kidding in the slightest bit, you're going to have rectal temperature taken. And she's like, I'm going to walk you out, I'm going to take you to where the orthopedic care is right now. And the point of that is we've had this race for 40-something years, and every person who's entered the finish line medical tent who has an exertional heat stroke has survived an exertional heat stroke. So we've done rectal temp on a few people that maybe you wouldn't in some situations, but then we've never missed it. Right? So you'd rather not miss any and have a couple people yell at you who maybe didn't want rectal temp. Right? So that's the give and take of that. But that's the Cns dysfunction in combination. Hyperthermia, a lot of people will argue what temperature you're considering and what you're looking for. The science of it, the physiology of it is the threshold for cell damage is probably 105.5. So technically the damage probably happens beyond that temperature, but to be safe, we've often categorized heat stroke in the 104, 105 range. But there's probably no permanent damage if you could probably be at a 104.8 and not have permanent damage ever. But we categorize it, it's better to be safe than sorry. There's no damage ever in cooling a person who's 104.5, they're just going to feel better faster. Okay, but the real damage is probably on 105.5. And we'll talk about why that temperature matters so much and why it's important to get an accurate temperature. So when we're talking about pre-hospital care, this is an important graph to consider. Hubbard, who I give credit for right here, he did this original graph back, well, he did the original data back in 1977, but it was in table format, and I felt like it lost its meaning. So I redid his data in 2010. And the point of this was he used an animal model, not surprisingly. It's really hard to find volunteers for heat stroke studies. You know, say like you're in the group that has no cooling for 60 minutes, and you're like, I'll do that one. So you can't do this in human studies, okay? You can only do it in human studies when they actually happen on their own, where people on their own induce heat stroke into themselves, like at a race. But you can't ever have people volunteer for a study because obviously you'd be out of your job really quickly. So they had an animal model, and they had passive heat stroke and exertional heat stroke. So passive heat stroke would be like your classic heat stroke, like heat wave, elderly people, infants left in cars. And then you have your exertional heat stroke here. This is an animal model, and so like as an example, the group out here, this is the number of minutes that they're above 105.5. Okay? This is the surviving percentage of those rats that they used in that particular study. The bad news, obviously, is the rats who were in the right portion of that data collection process. But the good news for humans is that the first 30 minutes, we have never had a death from exertional heat stroke if the temperature gets under 104 within 30 minutes. I'm talking about over 2,400 heat strokes we've tracked. Okay? Talking about at some of the biggest military bases, a lot of the biggest road races. But if someone who's presented with a heat stroke is cooled to under 104 within 30 minutes so far, knock on wood, we have not had a heat stroke death. I'm not saying there's not going to someday be a heat stroke death, but the point is that if we're up over 2,000 and fast cooling allows someone to survive, that's obviously what we want to continue to do. All right, so that's an important understanding of that, because you can't do that particular graph exactly like that with humans. All right, EHS needs to be treated prior to arrival at the hospital, as you can see the very successful model here at Falmouth. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So we're going to talk about prevention, rapid recognition, assessment, cooling, advanced care. This is all from that particular document. It's only a 4 or 5 page document, but it's really important in terms of trying to change some policies. So when we're talking about prevention, this is just kind of your good overview. If you're a grandparent or you're a parent of a kid who plays sports, it's a little outside the scope of what you have to do, obviously, in medical care here at the race, but it's still important for you to know. But these are the biggest factors, some of the biggest factors that influence the rate of rise of body temperature during exercise. So I'm going to quiz you right now, and I actually have gifts. Like this is like, let's make a deal of prices, right? I have presents. So what is the biggest factor that has a role in the rate of rise of your body temperature during exercise? What?
Hydration.
Okay, that is in the top 7 that I'm going to go over right now, but it's not number 1. What's next? Yes. What?
Weather.
Okay, so that's number 2. Excellent. So the environmental conditions, the wet bulb globe temperature, whatever term you want to use, is probably the number 2 reason. What's the biggest reason your temperature goes up during exercise, or the rate of the temperature?
Probably your rate of sweating.
What?
Your rate of sweating.
Yeah, but what influences how much you sweat?
Training.
Oh, we're getting close. None of those exactly. No. Okay, so it's the intensity of exercise. The intensity of the activity. So there was ones that are close, because someone said fitness, right? And if you're really fit, like picture a guy in the military, and the drill sergeant says we have to do, 5 miles in a set time, right? But if you're really fit, you can go at a low intensity to do that set thing, right? But if you go to a race, the really fit person can now run faster, so he can still drive his temperature up as high as a non-fit person. So when you have controlled intensity activity, like a picture like a football practice where they have to hit a gasser time in a set period, or a march, or a thing they're doing in the military, a really fit person benefits because they can go at 70% and it's cakewalk for them. I always use an example with my students. I ask my students, like, if we all went out to the track right now and ran a 7-minute mile, like, how hard would that be for you? And for most of my students, it would be like the max they ever could do, right? Because they're not runners. But if I ran a 7-minute mile, it would be the easiest thing I ever did right at that moment. And so my intensity would be very, very low. So that intensity is the key factor that drives the rate of rise of your body temperature. The second was the environmental conditions that you mentioned. When we talk about environmental conditions, what are the biggest factors that impact environmental load?
Humidity.
Yes, humidity by far is the biggest factor that influences the environmental load. About 70% of the environmental load is impacted by the humidity. What are the other ones? Yeah, so the temperature is about 10% of the environmental load, which is shocking because when you get up in the morning and you turn on the radio, they say it's going to be a blistering 95 degrees today. That's 10% of really what you care about. Okay? What's the last one? That's 20%. The sun. It's the sun. So radiation. So cloudy versus not. So you can have a 98-degree day, but if it's full cloud, it's very different than a full sun day outside. So that's just something to consider, those 3 factors. And also wind speed is a big factor that can help you and actually hurt you if it's really, really hot out and the temp's above your skin temperature. It's not going to be helpful if it's windy. So the reason why humidity matters, why does humidity matter? Yes, evaporation. So why is evaporation? What does that do? Yeah, so when you sweat and that droplet of sweat appears on your skin, when that sweat droplet evaporates into the air, that's when you lose heat. That's taking heat away from your body. When you have a high humidity, there's a very low water vapor pressure gradient, meaning there's a very little gradient for that sweat droplet to go into the atmosphere because that sweat droplet is as wet as the atmosphere and it's not going to evaporate. So that's why if you go to Phoenix, I gave a talk in Phoenix a few months ago and I had a person say, like, I am a high-level runner and I never sweat. I have never sweat. Like, so I said, you're telling me you did a 10-mile run at 5:30 pace. Okay, it's like an elite runner. And you think you don't sweat. You'd be dead from heat stroke like at the 4 mile. Okay? I said, you sweat, trust me. It's just that since it's 3% humidity, it evaporates before you ever see it. Your shirt's completely dry at the end. You have to do a lot less laundry in Phoenix, by the way. Okay? So everything's dry. So I explained to him, try to have him understand that. But it's that environment is impacting that. So another one was mentioned was hydration. That's probably 3rd or 4th. Every additional 1% body mass loss impacts your body temperature about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit during intense exercise in the heat. So if someone, 2 football, yeah. So every additional 1% body mass loss, your body temperature is about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit hotter during intense exercise in the heat. So as an example, if you have 2 football players standing next to each other at a football practice, one did a decent job hydrating during practice, he's 2% dehydrated. And that's hard to do because you have to drink a decent amount. The other one say it's 5% dehydrated. That would be normal for a football player at the end of practice. So those 2 people would be 1.5 degree difference just based on the hydration stats. It's better to consider one person compared against themselves. That's the best data set. So like you hydrated well one day, hydrated not well the other day, your body temperature will be different. Okay. The other one, I don't know, did anyone mention clothing? So clothing or equipment is another huge one. Picture a lot of military people have a lot of clothing and gear on. They have to carry 100-pound packs. Football players have a lot of gear on. Prevents the sweat from evaporating. You're also carrying more weight, which just makes anything else harder. Another big one, I don't know if it was mentioned, it's up there, but heat acclimatization. Okay, the more heat acclimatized you are, the more you cool yourself, the faster you cool down. So that takes about 2 weeks to fully optimized in your body to make the physiological changes. So the one benefit, amazingly, even though we have a lot of heat stroke at Falmouth, is people are usually heat acclimatized here because we're deep into the summer already. Whereas at a Boston Marathon, it's much riskier. Anything that happens in early spring is riskier because if you have that rare hot weather day, almost no one is heat acclimatized in the middle of April unless they've come from somewhere where they were purposely, where they were training in the heat. Obviously, elite athletes would be heat acclimatized because they purposely get heat acclimatized before events. So those are some of the big ones. Another one is could be drugs, supplements that people are on. Okay, so like you have certain medications, prescription drugs, ADHD medication. People are about a degree Fahrenheit hotter when they're on it versus not on it. Certain supplements, as I said. And then there's individual factors that are different between people. So, for instance, big people have higher sweat rates, and it's sometimes just harder to replace the fluid during those set periods of time. Give me an idea, if someone runs really hard at the Falmouth Road Race on a warm weather Falmouth Road Race, what do you think someone's sweat rate is per hour? Give me an idea. Yeah, that's actually a very good answer. Yeah, a high intensity, high level runner who's running in a warm weather race like that would be about 2 liters an hour. That's really good. But a football player in a practice with all that gear on and a big lineman, they have 3.5 liters per hour or 3 liters per hour. Imagine doing a 3-hour practice, right? You do a 3-hour practice, could be ballpark of 10, 11 liters. That's 23 pounds in one practice, right? And you might have another practice that afternoon, and you just lost 23 pounds. You have 4 hours now before the next one's happening, okay? So you do another one that afternoon, and then you're at dinner, and you feel really horrible, and you wonder why. Like, oh, I'm 30 pounds lighter than I was this morning, okay? It's almost all fluid, about 95% of it's fluid, okay? All right, so those are some of the pillars of prevention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I want to get into more of the pre-hospital care and stuff, but I mentioned heat acclimatization, phasing in the activity over time. People are a lot better off. You can tolerate the heat a lot more. Body cooling, concept of body cooling, this is not body cooling to treat someone who has an exertional heat stroke. This is body cooling to enhance athletic performance. This means, like, what do you do during a halftime, right? What do you do during breaks? Like, you're on offense, defense is on the field in football, and you're aggressively cooling while you're on the sideline in those 4 minutes you have. Because athletic performance is massively enhanced when your body temperature is lower. So if you're at 102.2 instead of 103.8, you're going to be much better performance. So to give you an example, at the previous World Cup for 2014, I worked with the Portugal national team. They were going to Brazil. So I helped work with them in terms of establishing their policies. And we utilized the halftime a lot more aggressively than other teams did because we had people aggressively cool during that 15 minutes. Soccer players from one half of running around for 45 minutes, it won't surprise you because you know what happens at Falmouth. But if it shocks people, and especially people in soccer, that 45 minutes running around, almost every player is over 103.5 if you're running around for 45 minutes in intense heat. And you know there's no subbing in international soccer in the first half. Someone can sub, but no one does sub because you only have 3 subs to work with for a whole game. So they use them deep into the second half. All right? So these guys come in at halftime, most of them are 104. So if you should be jumping, not exactly, you should be jumping in the tub because you want to go back out at 101. If you passively cool, just sit in an air-conditioned locker room, you're going back out at 103.1. And now you have this small window in the second half before you get back to a temperature where you're going to it's called volitional exhaustion, where you back off on your intensity on your own to protect yourself. Because if we didn't protect ourselves, we would have thousands of people having heat stroke across America every day while they go out for runs. When you get to dangerous temperatures, people know I'm getting hot and they lower their intensity. Okay? So there, in any sport, we're probably underutilizing the concept of body cooling. So we work with athletes in sports to try to maximize any minute they have to try to cool themselves. In fact, I think we have someone in the audience right now who goes to LSU. And I just recently heard LSU bought an industrial-sized freezer for the sideline of their football practices. Okay, I'm talking about like a freezer you can like walk in, like you would have like at a butcher shop. Okay, like you literally can walk in. But that's Division I football for you, right? You know, they can spend a few $100,000 on that, or maybe much more. What about blood temperature? I mentioned to you, we kind of covered that. The big part of it is not just knowing the temperature, obviously, but then making modifications. So if you work in team sports, you work in high schools, you work in military training sessions, you modify the work-to-rest ratio based on the environmental conditions, because obviously when it's higher, you have more breaks and longer breaks. So it's more time to drink, but it's also more time to cool down. All right, hydration. hydration we mentioned, I just gave you that stat before. You just get hotter. That's during intense exercise in the heat. Okay? That same relationship doesn't hold when you exercise in a 45-degree weather, but it is true during intense exercise in the heat. Does anybody have an idea why? Why does hydration matter more when you're doing hard exercise in the heat versus hard exercise in 45-degree weather?
In body mass loss versus increasing.
So you do use more liquid because of higher sweat rate. Any other thoughts?
Increased efficacy of sweating.
Say that again?
Increased efficacy of sweating.
Oh, like how efficient the sweat is in terms of cooling? That is also probably true, but it's not the main thing I'm thinking of right now. So the thing is this. When you do, if you're running like a Chicago Marathon in October and say it's a day that's 48 degrees, when it's that temperature, you basically don't have to produce almost any sweat. So the fluid you have in your body can stay within your heart, focus on your heart and your muscles. When you do that same thing at 95 degrees, that pool of blood in your body that was split 2 ways before now has to be split 3 ways because a massive amount of fluid now goes to your skin surface. So the heart is fighting for blood supply to keep blood pressure at a normal level, to keep cardiac output up, and the muscles are fighting for that blood supply to try to keep the performance at the same high level. But you don't, it can't be divided out 3 ways as nicely as it's divided out 2 ways. So when you lose a little bit of fluid in the heat, it matters more because there's less fluid to go around. Does that make sense? So that's why hydration matters so much in those conditions. Does anybody know what's the optimal temperature if anyone is interested, if we have any people who can break the world record in the marathon, like in the next, say, few weeks, what's the optimal temperature that you would want to run it in?
43 degrees. That's like around.
Yeah, so people are thinking it's somewhere around mid-40s ballpark for, so people are running at such a high intensity, these crazy people can run 420-something miles for 26 minutes in a row, which is staggering to consider, okay? Just even think about that. Take it back. Could anyone run a 420 mile in here right now? There are people in the world that basically can do this, okay? So, can anybody do a half of that? Can anybody run a 2:15 half right now? Half mile. Okay. So take it back to 1 lap. So think you guys can't even run 1 lap that they do for 100 laps. Okay? That gives you an idea of how fast they are. All right. So it's staggering, but it is that. Anyone watch the 2-hour thing that Nike did last year? Nike had a team that they tried to get people to break the 2-hour marathon. It's an awesome documentary if you want to watch it online. But they tried to find every single element that you could to optimize performance to make it happen. And the guy actually came within 28 seconds or 30 seconds of doing it. It wouldn't have counted as a world record because he was paced the whole time. New crew came out every couple miles to break the wind and create this V in front of him. But it's staggering to watch that he was like 2 minutes faster than anyone had run in history when they try to optimize all these particular factors. And that someone could even run that fast. Because it came from, if anyone wants to read a really interesting book that came out a few years ago called 2 Hours, where the whole book is speculating on if the human body can actually run under 2 hours. Is it physiologically possible? Okay? And I worked with that author. I was interviewed as a part of a group of people, and they literally interviewed 10 people at this dinner and some other people that we'd gotten together. And I was one of only 2 people that said it will happen someday. So there's quotes in that book that I wrote. I'm a big believer. People always like, oh, that's the best we can do, right? You know, imagine they said that 50 years ago, and everything's better now. So I'm sure we're going to figure out a way to run faster in the next 50 years, and legally. Okay. So I think one of the big factors is going to have to do with the whole body cooling strategies. If there's ways that we might be able to optimize that. All right. So I'm not going to get into sleep right now, although most of you probably wouldn't mind having more sleep, but it definitely can influence thermoregulation. Education is just to try to help people be better knowledgeable so they can implement the things I just mentioned. So I mentioned to you that this document came out in 2018. It was from a meeting that happened on campus on March 1st, 2016, where we brought in people from around the country who were, I think there was like 10 emergency room physicians who were actually part of that. So the steps to survival, not surprising, but we wanted to have it written on paper based on best practices right now. Rapid recognition, rapid assessment, rapid cooling, rapid advanced care. So first talking about rapid recognition. I actually don't have time to go through all these. Not that you would ever go get this on your own, but we actually published a chapter that said, how should a clinician deal with combative exertional heat stroke victims? Okay, so if you've worked Falmouth before, you've seen some crazy situations. So that chapter I wrote is 10 different crazy heat stroke victims. All survived, they're all fine now. Those are all fine. 10 people at all different road races. I think it was from 7 different, one soccer, one football, one mountain biker, a few shorter road races, a couple marathons, and it was some of the craziest stories we ever dealt with in our career. And it's something to consider because it's a really unique experience here. We've had some really unique situations. We could spend another hour talking about some of the ones we've just had at Falmouth in my 20 years. All right, so I wanted to the reasons why we wanted to have some of this document is that the dispatcher, when an ambulance is first called, and the first responders are obviously going to have a big factor in dictating outcomes. And making sure that they understand the situational awareness in terms of trying to understand this particular this thing, and also dispelling a lot of myths that are out there. Examples, okay? Hot, dry skin is something that's been in the medical literature for a really long time. I've treated 285 heat strokes in my career, and I have not had a hot, dry skin person yet. Okay, not one. And that is what we were taught when I was in school. That was what I was taught. That was the straight up the first thing. Look for hot, dry skin. That differentiates it from heat exhaustion. Okay. Anybody think how that leaked its way and permeated the entire medical literature for probably at least 100 years? Anybody know why? The big reason is that happens in classic heat stroke. And classic heat stroke in a lot of different parts of the world was way more common than exertional heat stroke because you'd have, for instance, in Paris in 2003, 12,000 people died from classic heat stroke in 8 days in Paris. Okay, 12,000 people died in a week. So the classic heat stroke there, the sweating, the thermoregulatory system has failed. The big difference with exertional heat stroke is it hasn't failed. Anyone you've treated, it's not failed, it's overwhelmed. There's a big difference between an overwhelming of the thermoregulatory system and a failure of the thermoregulatory system. You're simply generating too much heat at the Falmouth road race faster than you can dissipate the heat. So your temperature keeps climbing. If it was a 5K race, we'd be fine. They would get really hot, they would walk away, they'd go home, and no one would have heat stroke. Okay? And even if it was a 5-mile race, we probably would avoid 97% of those. But once you get to the 7-mile range, you get to 10-mile races, 20Ks, half marathons, those are your biggest risks. Things that are 30 to 90 minutes are your biggest risk because they're long enough that you can get hot enough, but they're short enough that you can run really hard. Okay? We don't see nearly the incidents, for instance, in marathons or ultramarathons. Almost heat strokes are almost never happen because you can't run hard enough to give yourself a heat stroke for a 100-mile race, right? What are you gonna do that at mile 13? They still gotta go 87 more miles. Okay? You can't do that in a long race. It's just not. It's not real. They happen occasionally, but the more common is 30 to 90-minute races. Okay, so hot, dry skin. Really a shame that we still see that. Don't pull too quickly. There's a ton of dispatchers that actually it's in the thing they read when you're on the phone. It says, "Don't pull them too quickly." And then there's still a lot of people out there that don't put them in cold water. They think it causes shock. There are people that say you use ice bags on peripheral arteries. Okay, that was in my actual textbook that I still save from when I was in school. And there's still documents that come out today. You could go online right now, and within 1 minute, I promise you can find the treatment of heat stroke that says put ice bags on the peripheral arteries. Okay, so that is a massive waste of a bag and ice because it does nothing to cool yourself. There's no cooling that happens with that particular modality. All right. So rapid recognition, you got to recognize it's heat stroke. Remember, go back to the diagnostic criteria. Cns dysfunction. People are doing intense exercise in the heat. Okay, so if you rule out cardiac, and person has been doing intense exercise in the heat, your brain should be jumping towards heat stroke. Why they're altered consciousness in front of you. There are a few other items it could be, but now if you do a rectal temperature, you immediately can factor in heat stroke, right? There are a few other things it could be. Could be an exertional sickling case. There's certain circumstances you have to understand when that would happen. Maybe a hypoglycemia, maybe a hyponatremia. There are reasons you could have an altered mental status during intense exercise in the heat. But if you have a 108 temperature with the altered mental status, now you know what you're dealing with, right? And you can move quickly to cool that person. All right, so we're talking about assessment. I already mentioned these two things earlier. This is just to perfectly be confusing. Picture like a coach trying to figure out what's happening for a youth event or a school that doesn't have an AT. All right, so heat exhaustion, heat stroke, sickling, hyponatremia, cardiac conditions, they have a lot of overlap between the signs and symptoms. Okay, but just remember what I told you with heat stroke, the 2 key diagnostic criteria, high temperature, altered CNS. You got to keep reminding yourself of that because heat exhaustion, for instance, could present with some minor alterations in CNS, but very similar other signs and symptoms like dizziness, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Those could both be present. So So when we're talking about body temperature assessment, this is the easiest crowd for me to talk to about doing rectal temperature. There are many places I go give talks that now, at this point, I stand behind a screen, and I say this because no one's happy when I tell them I have to do rectal temperature. So, but this is an easy crowd since you guys all know the benefits of rectal temperature. There are valid ways of doing it, but let me just tell you, urinary bladder, not a fun one to do in the field, okay? Pulmonary artery, gastrointestinal, esophageal, we do in the lab at UConn all the time because it's a really valid way of measuring temperature, but you need a conscious person who helps with the swallowing process while we do that. There's ingestible thermistors as well, but you can't kind of give a person's altered consciousness. You can't give them a pill to swallow and then wait 4 or 5 hours for it to be past the stomach and into the intestines. You could use that pill as a suppository. We just actually did a study to show that they're pretty accurate. So some research situations now will use it as a suppository. If someone have a bowel movement in the morning, we put it in as a suppository, and you don't have to have the probe wire like all day while you're doing a 9-hour mission and you're taking track of temperature. You now have the pill in place, and you have a radio receiver that you can keep track of. But these other ones we have shown conclusively are not accurate following intense exercise and heat. We published 7 different research studies. Oral, AURAL, which is really the real name for tympanic, because very rarely are you actually touching the tympanic membrane. Temporal, axillary, they're just not accurate. Everyone wants them to be accurate, but they're not accurate. Okay? They don't cheer. And we work with companies all the time that are coming up with new devices. I do think someday we'll have some kind of temperature wearable that is a good predictor of deep body temperature, but we don't have it right now. Okay? So once on-site rapid assessment of body temperature by EMS is if they don't have a PT that's already got it or not their physician. This is like more of a team sport, youth sport event. So rapid cooling, not surprising here, but I'll just show you the data so you feel smarter tonight. So 3 different things. This is cold water immersion. This is rotating cold wet towels all over the body. So like you have 8 towels on you at the same time with freezing cold water. And this is my lovely ice bags on the peripheral artery. Okay? So this is a long time with no cooling really that takes place. Here you can see the cooling rates. This is a very conservative 0.2. We just published a study of Falmouth data of 260 heat strokes, I think. 274, I think. 274 heat strokes. We had a cooling rate average of 0.22 degrees Celsius per minute. But when cold water immersion can actually be optimized even more, and mostly sometimes in the lab, but we probably could do maybe even more in the field. If more of the body is in the tub, more surface area of the body in the tub is better. Aggressively circulating the water will enhance cooling, and having colder water temperatures. Those are the big things. So in the lab, we actually got 0.35 degrees Celsius per minute. Okay, so that's even, think about how profoundly different that is than even from 0.22. So in like all the minutes matter, which I mentioned to you before. So. But field expedient, a realistic way in the field, obviously a very optimal method we have here. And we got some fast cooling. These are some other common ways. I mentioned ice packs, ice water immersion. These are some other ones that have just recently been kind of brought up in the literature. Just showing you, obviously, we want to be up in the 0.2s. This is the color immersion. This is the optimal one that's like 0.35. Just so you know, for people who work Falmouth brace, one of the biggest errors I always find is people forget to circulate the water. Okay? If you forget to circulate the water near the skin surface is 108 degrees. Because if the skins, they're 108, and then the water never moves, the water's going to be 108. And you have to keep introducing freezing cold water. Okay? So that's, if you want to optimize the cooling rates, you have to keep doing that. There are road races I've been to, they actually have like hockey sticks or paddles, or oars. Would they do that because the person doesn't want to have that hand in the freezing cold water for an hour straight providing medical care, and they'll actually use the oars to stir the water in the tubs. All right. So cold water immersion protocol, you're well aware of this. This is a typical like 150-gallon tub, which I believe we'll have a few of this year, right? 4 of them this year. A little bigger. So if someone, for instance, a bigger person, the cooling rate might be a little bit slower. Always using the towels under the armpits to make sure they don't slip in is a great move. Makes it a lot easier than if you ever have a combative person that's not meant, this is real truthful. I mean, if you have a big sheet underneath the armpits and you're kneeling behind it, you can take both sides of that sheet and clamp it, and it makes it harder for the combative person to move around. Okay? You're obviously doing it also to prevent them from slipping into the tub, right? But if you prevent them from moving, it just makes your job a lot easier when they're combative. This is very compelling data from the Falmouth road race, and this is in the medical literature. It's the largest data set ever published in the done within 10 minutes of collapse. And then home discharge was actually 93%. We're not recommending everyone be home discharged. It's just a unique situation at Falmouth that we do it because we have physicians who are very seasoned and we can monitor them for a long time and physicians can clear them. And Falmouth Hospital can't handle, like, remember 3 years ago we had 48 heat strokes? So they can't handle 48 heat strokes in their emergency room. Trust me, if you've ever been to the emergency room, though. Okay, maybe like 4 they could handle at any time.
What do we think, 2?
Ballpark. So I'm just giving you an idea that in some field settings, home discharge is possible. Obviously at the high school, college, pro sport level, you would always, the second you're done cooling, once they're at 103 or 102.5, that second you would send them to the hospital for the continued care they would need. But in our setting, we just can't do that for every single person. But we also have the people in place to take care of it. Tarp-assisted cooling is kind of similar to the rotating cold wet towels on the whole body. It's just another, sometimes you want to have a portable way of cooling someone. Imagine going to some remote cross-country race in the middle of some mountain, right? And you can bring a cooler filled with 15 towels, ice, and water, and you have a pretty effective modality of cooling someone. Similarly, you could use a tarp and then have a cooler filled with ice and water. We just finished a study with tarp-assisted cooling, and it was actually about 0.16 degrees Celsius per minute. So again, sorry. So last one, rapid advanced care. This is an example of an algorithm. Patient collapses during or after physical activity in warm weather. Assess responsiveness, we went over that. If it's no, provide emergency care for another reason. Assess Cns dysfunction if it's normal. You can obviously look towards other reasons why they're presenting to you. Disturbed, assess vital signs. We're looking at body temperature. If they're not hypothermic, there's another reason why they presented to you. For instance, it might be hyponatremia. You would consider an I-stat. You might be looking at blood sodium, blood glucose levels. But now if they're hot here still, and they're over 40.5, which is the ballpark of 105, initiate whole body cooling, and then take them out. I like to start the takeout at 103 because they're cooling so fast at that point that by the time you get them out completely and you get some dry clothes on them, they're already down to 101.5. All right? Transport to advanced care. All right? So before I go there, any questions? So one of the big concepts related to that is all of this is happening when you're cooling on site. Okay? The concept of cool first, transport second. I know that makes sense to you because you've worked Falmouth road race. But picture a high school sports field, picture a college football practice field, an NFL. All those people still need to do the same exact thing. Okay? They can't have a heat stroke present itself, wait, whatever, could be 30 minutes at some remote high schools, it could be 8 minutes, whatever, for an ambulance. The ambulance is on site for some period of time, probably at least 15, 20 minutes, and then they drive them back to the hospital, and then by the time they're in the hospital, it's not like they jump right in the tub the second they get there. Time passes there as well. So you're usually looking at 45 or 50 minutes from the time they collapse. That's if you recognize it right away to the moment they might get cold water immersion at the hospital. And we don't want to lose all those minutes because, as I explained to you, you have a 30-minute window to, so far, based on what we know in literature, to guarantee that they're going to survive. So we got to use those minutes on site. You remove them from the sports field. You might have a cold water immersion tub set up on the sideline, and you take their clothes off. You get a body temperature. You put them in the tub. You call an ambulance at the same time. The ambulance is going to be arriving, but you continue cooling. Okay, and then when you're down to 103, then you send them to the hospital. Obviously, I'm assuming there's medical care on site doing this, providing the care. So, do I still have a couple minutes, Chris?
Give me about 10.
10? Yeah. Good. So I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios to make this try to understand even better. Does anybody know the name Gavin Class? Okay, so Gavin Class is a football player at Towson State University in Baltimore, Maryland. And it's an example of trying to put all these pieces of the puzzle together and why they all matter. Okay, so the athletic trainers there had an immersion tub at the field because they wanted to have the right policies in place. He went down during a football practice in August a few years back, and they immediately thought it was heat stroke. So they got him to the sideline near where the tub was. They took off his equipment. Within a couple minutes, he was in the tub. But they also, at the same time, like I've recommended to you, they called for an ambulance. But being in Baltimore, the ambulance arrived within 5 minutes. So he only stayed in the tub for about 5 or 6 minutes. They took him out of the tub when the ambulance arrived. 90 minutes later, he was still 109 at the hospital. 109. Now, amazingly, he survived. But he had a 2-year recovery, and he had to have a liver transplant. Okay, 2-year recovery. So you guys have been around enough people at Falmouth to know that if he had stayed in the tub, it's very, very, very likely would have had dinner with his teammates that night, very likely. And at worst case scenario, one night in the hospital, okay? So they took him out, and he was obviously at least like 110 when he started, right? You know, something like that. And then he was still that hypothermic in the hospital. They did, when they recognized how hot he was, actually they didn't have as aggressive a cooling as they did in another scenario that I'm about to tell you about. But it just gives you an example of all the pieces of the puzzle. So they missed 2 pieces of the puzzle. One piece is they didn't get a rectal temperature on site. Having that rectal temperature would have been hugely powerful to try to wait on the shipment of that person, right? Because he's already in an immersion tub, and you can't do any better with cooling than where he is right now. Second thing is they didn't have cool first, transport second. So they had a lot of pieces of the puzzle. They had all the equipment in place. They recognized heat stroke right away. They got him in a tub really quickly, but there were parts of the puzzle that weren't put together. And so that gave him a 2-year recovery. Now, 99% of the time, at least, that person would have died in that situation. He just happened to have an amazingly healthy human being who was able to barely survive that particular incident. Now he's doing fantastic now, but he's had that was a 2-year period that he went through that. He came every few months for testing at Cordstring Institute as we helped him work his way back to activity, and he's actually competes now in the transplant games and some other like worldwide competitions and stuff, but made a recovery there. We actually have ironically, amazingly, have the family of one of the ones that's going to give you as an example now in the audience. Hunter Knight was a football player at University of Miami, and he now plays at Tulane. He had a very similar circumstance, football practice, had a exertional heat stroke, but unfortunately he had didn't really have any of the pieces of the puzzle properly cared for him in that situation. They didn't think of it was heat stroke. They did not have a tub on site. They didn't do rectal temperature. Obviously, they didn't cool on site. So he also faced a couple-year recovery afterwards from his particular thing. And as I just said, since he's playing now, but he eventually made his way back. But we're talking about people who make like 6-hour recoveries with us or 2-hour recoveries, and they're back to normal. These people have faced 2-year recoveries, and they were fortunate to just even survive. So to kind of wrap that up for you guys to understand, I always tell people the 0 to 30-minute window of being hypothermic above 105, then if you can keep it to 0 to 30 minutes, we think they're going to survive without long-term complications. If it's a 30 to 60-minute window, they often will survive. They will often have lasting complications, and some of them may be permanent complications. When I say lasting, it might be a year or 2, like I've told you with these recoveries. Some may be permanent. Okay? If it's over an hour of that temperature, which both Hunter and Gavin were, they most of the time died, like 89% at least of the time we pass away, okay? And then if they do survive, they almost always have permanent complications, okay? Without question, lasting complications, but it could be permanent. When I say permanent, there's 5 systems that are usually affected in your body that are permanent or long-term complications. One is liver issues, hence you can see people have liver transplants. Kidney issues, a lot of people have kidney dialysis for the long-term or kidney transplants. Muscular issues, so they might have, for instance, rhabdo, you might have heard of rhabdomyolysis, they might have that at a much lower threshold now in future activities. Fourth one is cognitive dysfunction. Okay, a lot of people's IQs are lower, they can't get back to the jobs that they've had before. Other things like very impatient or other things that might change for them. They've struggled in school, some people. And the fifth one is exercise heat intolerance. So a lot of people we work with at KSI have to move from southern climates, they have to move their family to northern climates, they can't ever live in the heat again because they don't thermoregulate properly anymore, okay? So those are people who were not treated properly. They were hypothermic for a long period of time, but they happened to survive the heat stroke, all right? So I wanted to give you an example of all those scenarios, and that's why wherever you are someday, when you ever see someone have a heat stroke, it could be some local 10K, it could be your kid's football practice field. All energy should be focused on one thing, and that's getting their temperature down as fast as humanly possible, okay, by any means necessary. So if it means 11 minutes for an ambulance to come, and you don't have a tub, get a bunch of towels, ice, water, bring them into a shower in the locker room, cold water shower, douse them with cold water hose, do anything to cool them down, and use any of those minutes, because even if it's not effective as cold water immersion, you're limiting the number of minutes that they're above that critical threshold. The one last scenario I just want to quickly say, John. So has anyone followed the news this past week related to exertional heat stroke?
Yes.
University of Maryland, okay? So this is a really important story to be told, and if you go to the KSI website, you go to our social media pages, we've posted a lot of recent articles. We've been quoted in New York Times and Washington Post and a lot of other articles recently. And what's made this case extremely unique, well, the heat stroke was May 29th, and Jordan died on June 13th. He was in a coma for a couple of weeks. He had to have a liver transplant too, but unfortunately passed away. And then the medical records came out in just the last couple of weeks, which is why we're seeing a lot of this attention right now. The family actually released the medical records to the media because they wanted everyone to see that he was not properly cared for. So he struggled at 5 p.m., started to struggle somewhere around 5 p.m. They didn't call an ambulance until 5:57. The ambulance arrived at 6:10. These are all documented in the numbers. And 6:35, he arrived at the hospital. Those are just numbers that were just taken off records that were released recently. Okay, so you remember the minutes I'm sharing with you? So he was at least super hypothermic at 5 p.m., right? He was having seizures, struggling to stand or do anything during practice. And we're at hospital at 6:30. He was 106 when he arrived at the hospital. So he's probably 109, 110 range when he went down, because we have 90 minutes, even passive cooling in 90 minutes, you're going to cool a little bit. The hospital did a fantastic job of cooling him. They used cold water immersion even, and they got him from 106 to 102 in just a very short period of time. But the damage, unfortunately, had been done already because he was hypothermic for quite a long period of time before that particular episode. So a Division I sports program did not have the proper care. And the amazing part of this whole story is if you saw the press conference a couple days ago, and if you didn't, I recommend you watch it. It's the first time in our country's history the president of the university and the athletic director stood up in front of the audience and the nation and said, we did not do rectal temperature assessment, we didn't do cold water immersion. An athletic director, non-medical person, is recognizing that best practices are these items. It was in their policies and procedures at the University of Maryland. It was not implemented that particular day. And they recognized and they admitted fault, which I give them a ton of credit for admitting fault, but it doesn't get Jordan back for us now when we needed to care for him. So I think I probably went over by a little bit, but hopefully that was useful for you. So thank you very much, everybody.
Does in-range self-hydration play any factor in preventing heat stroke?
That's a great question. So I don't have a specific answer to that because no one's ever done that research study. But I would, based on what I told you about during warm weather races, the fact that your temperature is higher when you're dehydrated, I would always recommend that people do as good of a job as possible during exercise because obviously it's hard to drink a decent amount of fluids when you're running really hard. But even if you do, we've shown a lot of our studies the benefits of partial rehydration. So if you finish at 2% versus 4%, you're a degree Fahrenheit cooler. So better to be 103 than 104, right? So obviously you want to do it in a safe manner. You never want to overhydrate, but if you can drink, a certain percentage of your sweat rate comfortably, like 70 to 80% of your sweat rate during an hour race, I think you're going to be better off. So,
Thank you.
yep.
All right, while we're changing over here, I think one of the really cool things too about, pardon the pun, but one of the really interesting things about this thing was that Gavin Class, the kid who had the liver transplant, who will never play sports again, was at Jordan's bedside in the ICU, the kid that died in Maryland. So he went to him and tried to be there for him. Obviously, the kid was unresponsive from the get-go. So terrible, terrible tragedy. But,
That Gavin Class story too is really interesting because he fought for the right to come back to sport. Right. And it made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court because the school would not let him come back to play football again because of the liver transplant. But I represented Gavin all the way to that level of the court system because we had tested him, and I said as long as you do the adjustable thermistor during his practices and stuff, and you're monitoring his temperature, I actually think he'll be the safest person on the field because you're going to have his temperature during practice the whole time. No other football player do you know the temperature of during practice. So he's at 102.5 or whatever, 103, whatever threshold you want to set, we can just give him a rest break at that time. But team physician refused to clear him, and then we ended up losing the battle, and they ended up not allowing him to return. But it worked its way through literally every level of the court system, and we lost on the last one. We had won at one level. So I'll tell you. It looks like we have a second. I'm going to be your halftime entertainer. So I'll tell you a funny story. that when we were at the Maryland Supreme Court, when it reached that level, we had, they always try to disparage the expert witnesses. So when I was called to be an expert witness, the opposing counsel for Towson spent time disparaging me as a witness. They always do that, that's typical. And then when the person was done, the lady was done, the judge who was sitting there, I could tell was salivating to wait till she was done speaking. And then the judge goes, well, I was a career military person and I played college football. And the one thing, last night when I prepared for today, I spent the entire time preparing, reading Dr. Casas' materials and all the stuff he's published. So of all the people who are going to present over the next week or so, he's the one I'm most interested in listening to. And then the lawyer just sat down. And he's like, you are clear to be an expert in this case. And I was trying not to crack up in the courtroom.
Again, welcome volunteers. First timers again? Okay, so it's my job to take away this scare tactic. So I should have introduced myself in the beginning. My name is John Jardine. I'm the now medical director of the Falmouth Road Race up until the beginning of this lecture when I gave Rob the award, right? Rob and I were co-directors up until last year, so now it's a medical director for me. I'm also the chief medical officer for the Corey Springer Institute, which Doug is the CEO, and for my real job, I work as an emergency medicine attending in Rhode Island. So my lecture is about preparation, and it's a little bit about, it's a little bit like Kurt Swartz's, preparing for the Boston Marathon on a lesser level. Like I said, we're part of that big cog, right? This is just the medical part of it. This is what we do. Another famous quote, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail, right? So it's all about the planning. We started planning for this race, probably the day after last year's race. And we've met through the year, and you guys all know how many meetings we've had, but here we go. So it's, in a couple of days, right? So what we're going to talk about tonight is I'll give you a brief overview of the race, especially for the new people, new volunteers. I talk about your roles and responsibilities as a medical team. We'll talk about the operations manual. We'll talk about where we are on the course and what's happening on the course. We're going to talk about some of the treatment protocols, and Doug went over that, just fine. When we get to the heat stroke part, we'll skip through that real quick. And then with the actual schedule of race day, like what's going to happen on Sunday, where you're supposed to be, things like that. I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we lost a friend of the race community last month. She died certainly unexpectedly. This is Denise Rawlinson. She's the medical director or was the medical director of the Run to Remember in Boston. She worked with us here in Falmouth, and she herself has run 90 marathons. Her goal was to run a marathon in every 50 states. She wasn't going to be here this year because she was going to be running in Alaska, number 49 for her. But she died suddenly last month, and we certainly will miss her energy. Anyway, so the Falmouth Road Race, or the New Balance Falmouth Road Race, started back in 1973. This is the 46th running of the race. It started as a race from one bar to another bar, which is why we get to 7 miles, because people say, how did you come up with 7 miles? From the Captain Kidd to the Four Brothers, now the BBC. They have registered 12,800 runners. They capped at 12,800. They actually have registered just 35 shy of 12,800. So they have a full field this year. And of course, there are lots of spectators. I don't think there's any way we can accurately count spectators, but certainly in the thousands of spectators. And the medical care is all provided by us, right? The volunteers. It's all provided by this team. We have a medical committee that meets regularly, and we have come up with the protocols and things like that. This is an older photo, but it's the same face essentially. We meet and we talk about how it's going to go, protocols, etc. We have published the operations manual. I believe you all got this in your 12,000 emails you got last week. So yeah, so this was in an email. Again, the operations manual, the medical manual, and then you got sort of specific emails as to where you're practicing in that regard as well. So really the goals of the medical team obviously is to provide quality medical care, right? We want to recognize injured people, get them to the right areas of care, and that may be on the course or at the finish line, sometimes at the hospital. We've developed protocols, we'll talk about those are in the manual. We have a communication system, right? We have to be able to talk to each other, we have to be able to talk to people on the course, we have to be able to talk to the hospitals, you know, the staff of the race. We have a very complicated or well thought out communication system. We have a medical record, okay? These people that we take care of now are patients, right? So we do have a medical record. We keep a medical record. I have records from the last umpteen years, you know, filed. We have them on file. Sometimes, you know, physicians want to see the record, what happened to them on race day. So it is an actual medical record. So, and we'll go over that in a bit. And then we have a medical training program, which obviously I don't have to speak to you about because you're here, right? So what are your roles and responsibilities? Well, certainly to attend the medical training program. Again, number one, you got it, you're here, good. Wear the assigned apparel. Whether or not you like the color. We're gonna issue you a T-shirt on race day. It looks more like this gentleman over here, the red, but it is a red shirt. It'll say, you know, medical team, whatever. You know, obviously it's to be identified in your treatment area on the course, etc. You'll get credentials as well. Assist with the setup of your particular areas. I was with Chris today. He has a lot of equipment. There's a lot of equipment in the tent. This is the finish line medical tent. There's a lot of equipment there. There's a lot of equipment in the other tents. I would suggest that when you arrive at your site, you know, go through the equipment, see where things are, you know where to find a blood pressure cuff, you know, that kind of thing, right? Know where things are. When you get to your assigned area as well, kind of go over your area, set up your area, and see, again, know where your stuff is, where things are, what you need quickly. New this year to the course medical tents, and by that I mean like Scranton Mariners, Mill Road. Chris has purchased used airline carts. You know, the airline carts that the flight attendants use, and each of the drawers will have medical equipment in it, and they're all set up exactly the same, and everything is labeled so that you'll know where everything is, so that if you are at Mariners or you're at Scranton or at Mill, these will all be the same things. Just please let me know if you see something like this going on.
Every year you come up with something new.
We can't have this going on.
Which straw will have the nips in it, please?
You'll be all set there. So the other thing we want you to do is assist with the visual triage of runners. When you're at your site, you're gonna, you're along the course. Obviously, you're gonna be seeing runners go by. It's our job to kind of pick out who looks sick or who's not doing well, etc. And then, of course, you're gonna act at your level of training. And obviously, you all know what that is, and you all have an assignment. So we don't expect you to do anything that you're not trained to do. Again, complete all medical records. These are patients now that we're taking care of, and we do have a medical record. It's pretty simple, really. We made it that way so that it's kind of checkbox and something that you can easily get through. Typically, we have folks that are volunteering that are not specifically licensed or medically trained, and they will be scribes, and they'll be doing medical records. They'll be following along with the patients to fill out the medical record. We ask you to do as good a job as you can. Occasionally I get medical records when I'm going through them after the race, and I see, Bob. That's all it says on the medical record. So if you can fill it in a little better than that. We also have a refusal of care form. So there are patients now, again, who will say, like, I'm fine. Same kind of thing for people in the medical field. If they want to refuse care, if they want to sign out against medical advice, they want to refuse care, they can. We do have a form for that as well. Again, maintain communication with the medical team. Let your team captains, and we'll talk about those, let them know when you arrive at your tent. If you have to leave for whatever reason, let them know that you're leaving. Keep us advised, myself or Chris advised, if someone is receiving care that is not given by the medical team, and that's happened in the past. Some, folks are trying to help out, and they're, trying to take care of somebody that's, that comes under our job, right? So we want to know about that. Please stick around to assist in the cleanup. This is a messy operation. When we talk about ice water and stuff, and it's, it's on the beach, it's muddy, it's sandy. Please, if you can stick around to help with cleanup, because everything from the tents goes back into the truck and goes back into storage for the next race. So I mean, we have to kind of, worry about cleanup. All right, where are we along the course? This is a map of the 7-mile course of the Falmouth road race from start to finish. You can see that we have a tent at the start. We have a tent we have 3 tents along the course, and then a tent at the finish line. And we'll kind of talk about each of these. The start line is down in Woods Hole. Again, it's at the Captain Kidd restaurant, but the start of the races in Woods Hole looks something like this. Okay. If you haven't been to Woods Hole, 12,800 people, right, are ready to go here. So this is what the start looks like. Obviously, we've never seen the start. We've been where we're supposed to be, but there is a medical tent at the start. It is just off this picture. It's, the road goes around the corner by the aquarium. Is that right? No.
With a building halfway down.
This one?
No, further down.
This one?
More.
Brick one?
Next one.
Brick building?
Actually, the stone building next.
Here?
Right there.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Here?
Right there.
Yep.
Oh, I see it. It's wrong on the map then, right?
Well, the other map had it in the parking lot, like in the bottom corner.
All right, good luck finding the medical tent. Who cares about those people? There will be, EMS will be at the start, and with the medical tent. As the runners move out of the start and along the course, EMS then follows, and then will, drop off at Aaron's Point. We'll talk about that. So there is a medical tent at the start, just in case. Along the race, thanks to Mel and Alban, the mobile medical team, there are 17 stations along the course. These are the mobile medical folks. They're on foot and on bikes and on anything else that gets them there. These are integral people along the course. If you're on the mobile medical team, you will meet at the fire station at 6 a.m. 0600. You will meet at the fire station, and then you will board a bus, and the bus will take you to your spots, right? So you will be dropped off along the course. These are some pictures. Thank you, whoever got me these pictures from last year, the year before. These are the mobile medical people. There will be teams of 2, typically. And again, these are the folks that are out on the course, you folks that are out on the course that are protecting the runners out there. Again, looking for, the sick or injured along the way. Our first official medical tent, so to speak, comes at Mill Road and Surf Drive. This is at mile 4. So mile 4 is the first tent. Folks that are at this tent, this is a tent set up in the parking lot. Anybody who is at this tent, I just have to remind you, there is no water at this tent. So you will be supplied with big, Poland Springs, big 5, 10 gallon, whatever they are, the big jugs of water. You will have plenty of water to use, like in a tub, etc. But there's no running water here. There's no facilities here. The next tent is at Scranton Avenue and Queen Street. Queen Street is the egress out off the course. There's the van shell for point of reference. This is between miles 5 and 6. There's the tent. This is a public house, not a public, town housing complex. So we have access to be there. Behind that little bush right there is a spigot for water. There'll be a hose there for water. So if you're at the Scranton Avenue tent, this is where you are located. This is a picture of the group at the Scranton Avenue tent. Coming around the harbor between 6 and 7 is Mariners Point. This is the Mariners Point tent on Powerhouse Road. The tent, as Regina would like to say, they're moving on up this year. They went from a 20 by 20 to a 20 by 40. They got lots of new real estate up there. And a hell of a view, so this is the group up at Mariners. Regina back there with her white glasses and flight attendant uniform. Regina is the team captain up at Mariners. Dr. Alex Hurd will be up there this year. What we have up at Mariners is we have our communications center. This is where all communications for the race are going, for medical communications are going through the communications center up at Mariners Point. Craig is there. Craig's going to be with Boyd this year, right? Craig will be there with Boyd, and they are monitoring all medical communications. So all 911 calls are coming in there, so we know that, you know, if somebody calls and says, hey, there's a runner down, we know that we can send our team as opposed to sending an ambulance. So this is the important communication center. We also are using the ham operators for runner identification. Like if somebody is looking for a runner, looking for a family member, again, all communications are going to go through the communication center. They know which runners are in which tents at which times and things like that. Alden will be up at Mariners. You find Alden up at Mariners. Alden has been with this race, I think, before it even started. Hanging out with Tommy Leonard somewhere.
Certainly was at the bars.
Yeah. I didn't say that. He's not happy. He's still not happy about the shirt. What he's happy about is that we got an air conditioning in his van. So there will be ambulances stationed up at Mariners Point as well, both Cape Cod Ambulance and Spalding Ambulance, and we'll talk about them a bit when we get to the finish line. So speaking of the finish line, down, of course, after the finish line, just after the finish line is the big finish line tent here that you see here is the finish line. There's also a smaller tent on the ball field that we talk about. The finish line medical tent is long and narrow because we have to fit on the beach there. This is what the finish line medical tent will look like. This is where you will find me. I will be at the finish line tent. That's my favorite volunteer. That's my daughter. You will also see Chris Troyanos there. Chris, our medical coordinator, who makes all this happen. On the right, you can see a picture of Chris. That's at this year's Boston Marathon, and I think he's asking the governor for some better weather. Also, in the finish line, you see Ginny, who I thanked earlier when we were talking about Rob. Ginny has been the nursing coordinator for many years and has been very helpful with making assignments and keeping Rob in line for several years as well. Dr. Art Crago, I'm afraid to say I haven't heard from him. I don't know if he's going to be there or not. Dr. Crago is one of the original medical directors from whom I took over, but he still shows up every year, so it's great to have him there. Dr. Casa, I think we have learned a lot about Dr. Casa. It's our pleasure to have him at the finish line as well. Again, he alluded to this article, and we'll look at some of the graphs again. But this is the article that says that what we do at the Falmouth Road is cold water immersion is the gold standard for treating exertional heat stroke. As I mentioned, Doug is the CEO of the Corey Stringer Institute. If you don't know, Corey Stringer was a Minnesota Viking who died from heat stroke while playing football. His widow gifted some money, her settlement from the NFL, gifted to Doug and the University of Connecticut to form the Corey Stringer Institute to study heat stroke and prevent heat strokes so that it would never happen again. And here it is happening at the University of Maryland. So, Corey Stringer Institute has been with us for the past, as a group, has been with us for the past 5 or 6 years doing research, as Doug has alluded to as well. This is back in the early days. This is Becca Stearns and Julie DiMartini. Julie's the one who did all the work with that article with the 274 heat strokes and all the data that came out of that. This is the group from Corey Stringer last year. They will be, there's going to be some researchers there from Corey Stringer Institute, and they will be wearing different colored T-shirts, so they're not, so they're recognizable from the medical team, so that in case there's an emergency, somebody comes up to them and says, we need help, and they don't know what to do. So there are pure researchers there just to do research on the runners and the heat stroke and stuff. That leads me to say that if you do see these folks at the finish line, ask them what they're doing, ask them, talk to them. It's what we're doing with some of the research here at the race is really interesting and really groundbreaking and life-saving for other people. This is just over the past 5 years, this is the amount of articles that have come out of the Falmouth road race that are published or are waiting to be published. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of science going on here. Every year we come down and we give a presentation to the board about the research that's going on here, and the board has been very supportive of what we do and what goes on. One of the cool things I got to do this year was we had a young girl, this is Olivia, who had a heat stroke last year at the Falmouth road race. She's a top high school athlete runner. Her parents were concerned that she wasn't going to be able to go back to running, that she was going to not do well. We brought her over to the University of Connecticut, did heat testing with her, and we were able to clear her to go back to running. I talked to her mother about a week ago. She's the captain of the cross-country team, and she's already in preseason running. This is fabulous Phil Moto. Where's Phil? He's here. Phil and his team at the finish line, at the actual finish line. These are the people that are plucking the athletes off the line. They have wheelchairs, they have stretchers. One person that you will also see in the finish line medical tent is Dr. Walco. He's a chiropractor here in town. He's been with us for the past 15 years or so. We have chiropractors, physical therapists, athletic trainers, massage therapists. So the people that come in with just, and I don't want to say just, but cramps or ankle strains or different orthopedic type injuries, they deal with exclusively in the back of the tent and do quite well, again, getting these people home. Don't forget about EMS. Again, we have both Cape Cod Ambulance and Spalding Ambulance at the tents and available on the course. We have real good EMS coverage. We don't really have to tax the town much at all as far as EMS coverage, so that's a good thing. As I mentioned, there is a small tent on the ball field because as the runners go by the finish line and then they come around and they come around and then they come back to the ball field, which obviously is right across the street, there is going to be a tent over there that's identified for EMS. If anybody needs attention, there are going to be people there that will escort them across the course, across the street to the finish line medical. There's also an information booth there for people who are looking for lost runners, loved ones, family, whatever, and they will be directed again to wherever they are. There are gators going to be circulating around the course. These are the patient transport as well, and the sort of the tight areas. And of course, the town ambulances are going to be there when needed. One of the unique things we have that we've used in other races and we started to use here in Falmouth is a thing called race guards, and these are people who are medically trained but are running in the race. So they run in pairs, they have a radio, they have an AED, they run with equipment, and they will be staggered throughout the race so that if somebody drops within the race, they are there, they radio for help, and they can start administering care right away. So this is a sort of unique system called race guards. Don't forget about the hospital. If you are unfortunate enough to be working that day, there will be ice tubs in the ER in case people bypass the system or somehow get up to the hospital before they get care. There will be ice tubs in the ER for folks that get there. So protocols. What are protocols? Well, if you're in the medical field, you're in EMS, you know what protocols are. It's a way that we can sort of stick to a standard of care, right? And the protocols that we have for the Falmouth Road Race were developed with EMS, so it's nothing strange or new. They were developed with the Commonwealth, and we have some specific protocols that are, that we would call specific to the, say, a warm weather race, and they are in your manual. These are the protocols that we have sort of outlined in the medical operations manual, just because we think things like these, obviously heat illness, asthma, allergic reactions. These are things you're going to see sort of regularly in the warm weather and certainly in the summer, so they're highlighted in the medical operations manual. Any other protocols that may come up are going to be just whatever EMS would do on any other normal day. So the way our protocol works is that patients come into the tent. As Doug said, they all get a rectal temperature, whether they need it or not. Now, the people that are brought in that are essentially, or if they're unresponsive, if they need assistance getting in, then these are the people that really need a rectal temperature. If they come in with a sprained ankle, maybe not so much, but part of our protocol is to get a temperature on everybody. It's at this point when the patient comes in and get a rectal temperature, this is where we're going to start the medical record. So the record will start, with the patient when they arrive in the tent and they become a patient officially. The record, like I said, the record will follow the patient wherever they go. The scribes will have clipboards with the chart, and they will kind of follow the patient along so that, if they go from a tub to a resting phase to something else, the chart is following them around. We will have alpha and numeric lists of all the runners, so digitally, right, or electronically. We will have lists of all the runners, by number, by name, so that if somebody gets in and they can't identify themselves, or we can't identify them, we can, look up their number or name or whatever. So those lists are available in all the tents as well as the hospital. Doug kind of alluded to this a little bit. When somebody collapses and they're brought into the medical tent, I say, think of the 6 H's, right? Is it heat? Is it the heart? Is it hyponatremia? Is it hypoglycemia? Is it a sickling thing or a hemoglobin problem, or is it a head injury? For the Falmouth road race, we're going to see a lot of heat. We've already talked about that. I like to add the 7th H because we never know, right? Yeah, you just have to be prepared for everything, and we sort of are. Hyponatremia, hyponatremia is a low sodium. For those of you who are not medically trained, we don't see a lot of hyponatremia in this race. This is a short race. Typically in the marathons, 4 hours or so, you may see some hyponatremia, but typically don't see it here. It's not usually a problem. So exertional heat illness, Doug told you about. It's not that the body can't compensate. It's just that it's overwhelmed. Right? The body's overwhelmed. If you can't get rid of the heat that you're producing, then the heat builds up, and it builds up to a toxic level, and it affects all the organ systems, much like sepsis for those of us in the medical field, and especially as particular to the central nervous system. So some of the other heat illnesses, though, that you may see: heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and then of course heat stroke we talked about. Heat cramps, there's some debate as to whether they're actually caused by the heat, but these are folks that will come in that are having cramping of the large muscles, the legs, the abdominal wall sometimes. And it's sometimes because they're sweating too much, they're losing all their electrolytes. The way that we treat that is we just give them, obviously, rest in a cool environment. We give them PO hydration. Sometimes they need IV hydration. This is where the sports drinks come in handy because of the electrolyte replacement. And then, if there's protracted cramping, if there's other problems, they may need to go to the hospital. But for the most part, again, we have the chiropractors, the PTs, massage therapists can work on these folks as well. Heat exhaustion is probably going to be the most common thing you're going to see. This is just the inability to continue exercise in the heat. It's a compensation problem. It's usually due to fluid depletion from sweating or not drinking enough. And you give these people fluids, and usually they get better sort of right away. Again, the symptoms, though, are kind of non-specific. As Doug talked about, a lot of these things overlap. These people just generally don't feel well. They feel tired. They may be vomiting. They might have a headache. The important thing, though, is that the mental status remains normal, right? These people are awake. They're talking. They're walking. These are not people that we're worried about heat stroke. Heat stroke, though, on the other hand, as Doug said, is defined as a body temperature, and we use 104. Our protocol is 104, just to be clear, and the central nervous system dysfunction. Again, these people they can be unresponsive, they can be combative, they can be agitated, they can have seizures. It's anything that affects the central nervous system. They typically can't walk, and that's why Phil and his team out on the finish line are picking these people up with stretchers and wheelchairs. Doug showed this slide as well. We know that, again, he went over obviously very well. The faster we get people cooled, the better they're going to be, the better survivability, right? Lots of cooling methods have been tested, as he talked about as well, and you see that ice water immersion is clearly superior in cooling these people. That's how we have come up with the tub. And it is actually a tub. It's a Rubbermaid 50-gallon tub. It's filled with ice water. Doug and I had talked. This is we use 50-gallon tubs. We talked about getting a deeper tub. We talked about getting a 100-gallon tub, which I went to, and this is not to plug Tractor Supply Company, but I went to Tractor Supply Company yesterday, and I bought 4 100-gallon tubs for the cost of $69.99 on sale. $69 per tub. So when kids are dying in the University of Maryland and other places for the cost of a $69 tub and some ice water, it's wrong. Okay, so that's just a commentary.
I lived out west for 5 years, and we had a Tractor Supply in town. They donated a pig trough, water trough for the entire 2-a-days that we just brought back.
I'm going back to my receipt.
Yeah, they donated it. They let us borrow it for 2 weeks.
That's awesome.
For free. So, I mean, even for free, there's no excuse.
Right.
So.
Well, the people, and again, I'm not plugging Tractor Supply. The people there are great. The kid that was selling me the things was like 5'9", about 250. I go, could you do me a favor? Could you get in it? Sure, he said. So he gets in, and he's sitting in the tub, and I'm like, yeah, that's good. Everything's good. He goes, what are you going to use this for? And I said, well, at a race, we're going to be done. And they thought it was the coolest thing. They gave me a hat. They gave me a free hat. So there. So when they come in and they're triaged and they get a rectal temperature, if they have a high temperature or they otherwise appear ill, then they'll be handed off to treatment teams. And Ginny and Chris and I will, you'll be sort of divvied up into teams, and you'll get a patient. The patient will come to the team. Again, your treatment area may look something like this. There's the tub. The tubs will be full of water. We wait with the ice. We'll talk about that. These stretchers are mesh stretchers. It's just like a piece of mesh screen, which is awesome because you can pick the patients up and you dunk them right into the water, like a tea bag. There's little foam kneelers there. These are pitchers. Doug talked about, the water is cold and the water gets cold when your hands are in there. But you want to circulate the water. You want to keep the water moving. So the pitchers are to kind of help, do that. We don't have doors or anything.
You got Tractor Supply.
I'm going to get another hat. All right, so what happens is then, the patients, if they're over 104, they have Cns dysfunction, you get a rectal temperature, they're handed off to the treatment team, then they're dumped in the tub. And that looks something like this. That's a blurry picture, just so we can't see who the person is. But again, you can see that they're kind of sitting in the tub with ice water. Vigorous massage is applied. We massage the patients. We stir the water, as Doug talked about. You want to keep the water circulating so that it's always cold and it's always icy. You can massage their arms and legs with wet towels, etc. Rectal temperatures. If you're recording on the chart every 5 minutes, we'll record a rectal temperature, or we do, for the most part, continuously monitor temperatures. We have these thermistors. We have smaller ones now, but this is a thermistor that will, there will be a rectal probe, and it will continuously monitor the patient's temperature. You can see that's 7.9. Just for the new people, we have seen 111 degrees. We've seen 112 degrees in patients. So the patient came in at 109 and went up to 112. So again, these folks are going to have a rectal probe inserted, and you'll say, well, how far do I put that in? There was a study done. Alden wanted to volunteer, but insertion length is 6 inches. So when you are working it with the rectal probe, it has to go in 6 inches. So it just goes to show you, if you want to do a research project, there's probably something you can find to do. Anyway, so this is important as far as our protocol goes. When they get down to 102, that's our protocol, or they have spent 20 minutes in the tub, they come out of the tub. Again, we will be there watching, Dr. Casas, myself, other physicians will be watching. If we see that their cooling rate is going fast, if they're cooling very quickly, we may pull them out sooner, as Doug said, at a 103 or maybe 103.5. You know, we're watching the cooling rate. But our protocol, just by protocol, says 102 or 20 minutes in the tub. So they come out of the tub, they will, you know, rest a bit, whatever. We do have IV equipment and we do have ACLS equipment if we need it. We very rarely use IV fluids, believe it or not, for these people. It's sometimes not a fluid issue, or certainly nothing that they can't replace by mouth, right? So we typically don't have to use IVs, but if they are available, should you need it. We do have a pharmacist in the finish line and Mariner's Point tents. So if you need medications, we do have a sort of a list of medications that we keep that we think we would need in an emergency, and the pharmacists are there to give it out. If you do start an IV, I recommend the Coban because tape doesn't really stick all that well on these people. So occasionally when we cool people off, they start to go the other way. So they're cooling rapidly and their hypothalamus doesn't reset, and they continue to cool, and they may actually get a little chilly, and they may actually you know, start to go the other way. Luckily, we have a thing called the sun out the back here, so you can wrap them in warm blankets. We have blankets, and you can put them out in the sun, and you know, they're not going to die from shivering, right? They are going to die from hypothermia. So once they're cooled, they're moved to a recovery area, and we'll have sort of a recovery area set up where people will be watching them, you know, give them something to drink, give them something to eat. There's oranges and bananas and things like that to help them recover. And again, they're watched while they're recovering. We usually watch them for about 20 to 60 minutes, and again, these are under direct observation the whole time. When they have a normal temperature, normal vital signs, they're taking PO, they're cognitively fine, they have somebody to come pick them up. You know, these patients we do send home from the tent. Okay, not a lot of races will do that. As Doug said, you know, a lot of places will send the patients anyway, but we do send them home. Occasionally, we do have to send folks up to the ER for additional care. But the goal, really, the first and foremost goal is, as Doug said, is to cool first, transport second. Right? We want to do on-site cooling. We want to do cooling as quickly as we can, and certainly under that 30-minute time. And of course, we don't want to overcrowd the ER. If all of these patients went to the, you know, all went to the hospital at once, it would be disastrous.
So I've been mobile before, and when I was mobile once, we had a guy go down like right at about the 6.5 mark, like just cresting the hill. And we just got him on a stretcher, gave the stretcher to the ambulance. You know, by the time we got back to the street, the ambulance is there, we traded stretchers, and off he goes. When we do mobile like that, do they go to one of the tents?
They go to one of the tents, yes. One of the things that you will see with the protocols is that we sort of supersede the Commonwealth protocols, meaning that if somebody like that, instead of going to the ER, they're going to go to one of the closest tents. So anybody taking off the course, anybody who's heated up is going to go to one of the closest tents as opposed to going to the ER. Now on the front end of the race, you know, the start, mile 1, 2, whatever, if something happens over there, that may be a different story. They may end up going uptown to the ER. But typically, the transport is to one of the medical tents. Okay, so what to expect? Well, the elite runners run this race in about 30, 35, 40 minutes. They are quickly across the finish line. So about the 30-minute mark or so, you're going to start to see people across the finish line. We have treated the elite male leader and the second female in the medical tent, believe it or not. So these people are, you know, they do heat up, they run extra hard. Doug talked about your intensity, right? This is an intense race, and it's intense for them. They run hard, they run fast. They cool off quickly. They don't have a lot of body fat, obviously, and they cool quickly. Within 45 minutes to, you see 60 to 90 minutes is, and I'm going to show you a graph where the pack, this is where the pack of the race is coming through, right? This is where all the action happens. And then, the nice thing about 3 or 4 hours later, we're closing down, we're going home, and you would spend another 4 hours in traffic trying to get the hell out of here. So, but it's a it's a fun day, it's a fast day, it's a lot of fun. I showed this graph when I when I talked to Dr. Davis. When I talked about Dr. Davis, we've done my past 16 races here, 348 heat sprints, 348 just heat sprints. And if you look at again, Doug showed a number. This is a little bit updated about the number of people who were transported at heat strokes and the number of people who went home. 88% of people, 88, 93, a good number of people, 9 out of 10 people are going to go home from the tent. So that's obviously a good thing. This was part of a study that was done. This shows 2014, 15, and 16. I can tell you in 2015 we had 42 heat strokes, something like that. You can see where the bulk of the pack is coming through around the 10, 11 o'clock time, right? So that's where this is where the bulk of the people are coming. They run about an hour or so. And just remember, it isn't all about heat, right? Because there have been years where, I guess there was a year here in 1999, I believe it was, when it rained, and they were treating hypothermia. Certainly that was the case in Boston this year. Orthopedic injuries, this is an x-ray of a woman that came across the finish line and then finish line medical tent. We do see asthma. You will probably see asthma, especially with this weather that's been going on. Bee stings, lacerations, coughing, colds, whatever. We're sort of prepared for most everything. This is, prior to 2012, orthopedic data was kept separately from what we call medical data. So this is really, from 2012 to 2017, you can see that we treated 527. This is all comers. So this is all comers to the tent, 527. 8% transport to the ER, which means that 92% of the people went home. All right, so the goal really is to get these people home and not to the ER. All right, people ask, what should I bring? If you want to bring your own stethoscope, you can bring your own stethoscope. I showed you the equipment cards. Chris has lots of equipment. There's stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs. There's really nothing that you need of your own if you don't want, unless you want something that's yours. If you wear a watch, I would suggest that it be waterproof because you're probably going to get wet. It's probably going to get wet, and we don't want to ruin anybody's electronic equipment. This is an old slide because I would tell people to bring their cameras. Nowadays, everybody has a smartphone and it has a camera right with it. So, but I do like, obviously, I like pictures. I like new pictures. So anybody at new sites or take new pictures, I do like to update the pictures for the presentation. Remember sunscreen, and I know that I think Chris has sunscreen as well, but remember to protect yourself, right? If it's going to be a sunny day, you're going to be out in the sun, drink lots of water, wear sunscreen, that whole bit. And then as far as the cold water goes, Dr. Gagnon, I saw he was here. Dr. Gagnon brings a ladle. He brings his own ladle so that he can stir the cold water, and the insulated gloves and the ladle, and so whatever gets you through the day, right? So sun will rise on race day, and we will want you there at the latest at 7 a.m. Again, you all got emails about your different areas, 0600 for the team at the fire station. Otherwise, we want everybody, should be at your tent and operational, not operational, but at least at your tent at your assignment by 7 o'clock, 0700, right? At some point in the finish line tent, and I hope it happens in other tents, we will have a sort of a gathering. In this case, Chris will gather everybody together. We'll give just go over what's going to happen once again when you're in the tent, what the day is going to be like. We'll just make some announcements. We will do a mock patient. We'll show you what it looks like when a patient comes in. They come in, they go to triage, they go to the tub, etc. Just to see how it kind of runs through in the tent.
I told you that we keep the ice in the ice bags until like the race starts, and then you can put the ice. Otherwise, the ice will melt and not be as effective. So at some point, we'll say, okay, everybody start putting the ice in the tubs. You can set up your cots and blankets and stuff, and then again by 9:30, the elite people are coming through. So the race, the women's race starts at 8:50. The men's race starts at 9 o'clock. The wheelchair, the mobility impaired starts 8:40, 8:45, something like that. So those folks are going to be coming through quickly. They come first, and then the runners will come about 30, 35 minutes in. You'll start seeing runners come across. I showed this slide with Dr. Davis as well. This was a patient from last year. Not all patients look like this. They typically look like this. These are probably, for people in the medical care, these are probably some of the sickest people you will see.
But I don't think I looked like that when we started.
Yeah. So, and again, these same people are going to get up, and 90% of these people are going to get up and go home. So remember that, right? But they are some sick people, and again, not to scare anybody, but these are critically ill people. These are just some scenes from the year. Sometimes they vomit, sometimes they lose their bowels, etc. in the tubs. If that happens, we put that tub out of service, obviously, and then we have plenty of replacement tubs that we can then fill and use new. Again, this is a team activity, right? Nobody's alone in this. So if you do have a sick patient, there's lots of help. There's lots of different levels of help, and everybody, we're all here to help, and we all kind of jump in. This is 2014, and I like this slide because this woman right here is Kelsey Stringer. That's Corey's widow. In 2014, she and her son came to the medical tent to see what happens here at Falmouth, and it was quite emotional for her because she had never seen heat stroke. She never saw what happened to Corey and was quite taken by it. And she has since this time been the biggest proponent of the Falmouth road race and what we do for heat stroke, like nationally when she speaks. This is a guy from last year. Again, these are sick people. 90% of these people are going to get up and go home from the tent. It's pretty amazing. I remind you that it's messy, right? So please stick around for cleanup. We have to clean everything up. It's back in the truck. Things get messy. It's messy. Another famous quote I like quotes. It's tough to make predictions, right? We don't know what's going to happen. We're watching the weather. We were watching the weather today. We're worried about tomorrow night or Saturday night. For the kids' race and stuff. So we have our eye on the weather. You can't really. We're not really. We don't exactly know. This is rated G, so we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but we have our eye on the weather. But we do know that whatever happens, they're coming. Right? The 12,800 people will be running the Falmouth Road Race, so we know that they're going to come. One of the things we do use at the finish line, and you will see, is a wet bulb globe temperature. We have a wet bulb globe thermometer. It measures heat, humidity, the wind speed, the sun's ambient energy. Did you see that slide? Yuri Hosokawa finished her PhD with the Corey Stringer Institute and has gone back home to Japan. And miss her dearly. She loved Falmouth, and she sent me an email the other day to say so. Again, WBGT gives us an indication of how actually hot it is, if that makes sense, right? How hot it is, how humid it is, the wind speed, etc. There are lots of guidelines that we use, but if you look at the athletic training guidelines, it gives us an indication of when is it dangerous, when do we have to start, cutting back, when, God forbid, would you have to cancel the race, things like that. So, in summary, the warning signals of heat illness, heat stroke may not be that obvious, right? There's a lot of overlapping things. There's a lot of overlap in this sort of spectrum of disease. I think Doug did an outstanding job in defining heat stroke. But again, according to our protocol, greater than 104 rectally and the ultraventostat. So this is the definition of heat stroke that we're looking for. Again, based on that one article that says it's the gold standard, the key is to get the temperature down quickly. That's why we're here. That's what we do. Secondly, we cool first, transport second. We don't, we don't send people off in an ambulance until they're cooled if they have to go. And we learn a lot about the tub, and that's obviously what we use in Falmouth. So I want to thank the Falmouth board. The board of directors have been very understanding and very supportive of us with both the KSI, with the medical committee. They know what you do, they know how much you do, and they appreciate what we do and what you do here. So one final quote is, there's a good chance to shut up. So I'm going to shut up. I'm going to finish. If anybody has any questions, comments for myself, Doug is here, Chris is here, Alden is here. If you have any questions, comments, please, anytime. Otherwise, thank you all. Chris, you want to say something?
Thank Dean for not only speaking, great presentation, but hosting the event tonight. So, John, thank you so much for that. John is right at the bin right now, so I'm sure he'll hear you, but thanks for him as well. Before you leave, I'd ask a question, just a favor. We've got, I think, 5 or 6 of these posters. These posters were made up by one of the interns at the Falmouth Road Race, kind of depicting the ball field. And we'd like you to do is, we've got, I think, 6 of them. If I can have each of you sign each of the 6, and we'd like to give these to our speakers as a thank you. And then the other 2, I'm going to raffle off 2 of you after this weekend. So we'll do a blind raffle with all the group that came. Again, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight. It's much appreciated. We got a big day on Sunday. We're going to have to go out for fun. We'll see you then.